Before the Republic, Rome was a monarchy, a form of governance that combined Italic tradition, Etruscan influence, and evolving notions of sacred authority. According to Roman annalists, 7 kings ruled the city from its mythical founding in 753 BCE until the expulsion of the Tarquins in 509 BCE. While these names, Romulus, Numa, Tullus, Ancus, and the Tarquinii, blend legend and memory, archaeological discoveries confirm that during this period, the settlement on the Palatine Hill transformed from a cluster of pastoral huts into a structured urban community. Excavations beneath the Forum Romanum have revealed post holes, hut foundations, and early fortifications consistent with an 8th century BCE proto-urban phase, aligning roughly with the traditional date of Rome's founding. The monarchy that emerged in this setting was not absolute in the later sense. It resembled a tribal kingship, a leadership role dependent upon both religious legitimacy and the consent of aristocratic elders. The rex served as the chief priest, war leader, and judge, embodying the unity of spiritual and temporal authority characteristic of early Italic societies. This fusion of religion and rulership became a recurring pattern in Roman political culture, where public office was defined as a sacred trust rather than a personal right. The Rex Sacrorum, King of Rights, preserved even after the monarchy's abolition, demonstrates how deeply embedded this religious dimension was in the structure of Roman governance. Archaeological and linguistic evidence indicates that contact with the Etruscans during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE introduced new models of statecraft and urban organization. Etruscan engineers and artisans contributed to the transformation of Rome's infrastructure, the paving of the Forum Valley, the construction of drainage systems such as the Cloaca Maxima, and the introduction of monumental architecture using stone and terracotta. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, traditionally attributed to Tarquinius Priscus and completed under Tarquinius Superbus, stands as a visible marker of this Etruscan influence. Its tripartite design and dedication to the Capitoline Triad reflect both religious syncretism and political ambition, the projection of Rome as a city capable of rivaling her northern neighbors. Interpretively, this period demonstrates how Rome's monarchy functioned as a laboratory of governance. The kings introduced the first census, organized military service by property class, and codified civic rituals that later Republican magistrates inherited. Servius Tullius, the 6th king, is particularly notable for his administrative reforms. Ancient sources such as Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus describe his reorganization of Roman citizens into centurii, voting and military units, based on wealth and equipment. This classification system linked military obligation with political representation, an early expression of the principle that civic privilege should correspond to public service. Archaeological surveys of early fortifications and sanctuaries suggest an increasingly complex society, moving beyond clan-based loyalties toward territorial and institutional cohesion. The final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, represents both the zenith and the collapse of the monarchical system. Later tradition portrays him as a tyrant who ruled without consent, suppressing the Senate and relying on personal guards. While details remain uncertain, the political dynamic is clear. The concentration of authority in one figure provoked resistance among Rome's aristocratic families. The expulsion of Tarquinius around 509 BCE, precipitated by the outrage following the assault on Lucretia, symbolized a collective rejection of autocracy. Whether or not the episode unfolded precisely as described, its endurance in Roman memory underscores a core ideological transformation, the belief that libertas, freedom from kingship, was the defining virtue of the Roman state. Material evidence supports a genuine rupture around the turn of the 6th to 5th century BCE. Funerary inscriptions, weapon deposits, and patterns of urban rebuilding suggest significant social reorganization. The disappearance of royal titulature and the emergence of new magistracies, later known as consuls, point to an institutional transition rather than a sudden collapse. According to later Roman annalists, power was transferred from the rex to annually elected officials, the consuls, and to a permanent advisory body, the Cincinnatus. This reconfiguration of authority provided checks on individual power while preserving administrative continuity. The shift from hereditary rule to collective governance reflects a broader Mediterranean trend during the Archaic Age. The replacement of monarchic systems by oligarchic republics, as seen in Greek polis and Etruscan city leagues. Interpretively, the Roman experience illustrates how internal elite dynamics, not popular revolt, often catalyzed constitutional change. The overthrow of the kings was not a democratic revolution but a patrician assertion of autonomy. Yet, in codifying this act as the foundation of liberty, Rome established a political mythology that endured for centuries. The Republic's later identity as a community of laws, not men, drew its moral power from the remembered rejection of royal arrogance. The residential publica was thus born not merely from political necessity but from a cultural conviction that no single individual should embody the will of the state. Records indicate that, even after the monarchy's abolition, elements of royal ritual survived. The Regia on the Via Sacra remained the ceremonial seat of priestly authority, and the office of Rex Sacrorum continued to perform rites once reserved for the king. This careful preservation of religious continuity ensured legitimacy during the Republic's formative years. It also reveals a pragmatic Roman tendency: innovation without rupture, reform within tradition. By retaining sacred institutions while eliminating political kingship, the early republic managed to stabilize itself amidst potential chaos. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Rome had completed its transformation from tribal monarchy to civic state. The kings had laid the infrastructural and ideological groundwork: temples, walls, institutions, and rituals. Their legacy endured in the Republic's political architecture and collective memory. The monarchy's fall did not erase its achievements. It provided the framework upon which the Republic would construct its own identity. As the monarchy passed into memory, Rome's aristocracy faced the task of governance, to replace a single ruler with a system, and to prove that a city could rule itself without a king. In 509 BCE, the expulsion of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus set in motion one of the most influential political transformations in history. What followed was not chaos but careful construction, the deliberate creation of a new order designed to prevent the return of monarchy. The residential publica, literally the public affair, was born from both fear and pragmatism. Rome's aristocracy sought to preserve unity and stability while ensuring that no single man could again dominate the state. The earliest form of the republic replaced the king with 2 annually elected magistrates, the consuls. Each consul held imperium, the supreme authority to command armies and enforce the law, but their powers were deliberately constrained. They served together, not singly, and for a term limited to 1 year. This duality embodied the principle of collegiality, a system designed to prevent the concentration of power that had defined the monarchy. The symbolic gesture of both consuls sharing the fasces, the rods and axe representing lawful authority, signified the Republic's new ethos: power divided, not possessed. Archaeological and textual evidence alike indicate that this early republic retained much of the monarchy's administrative continuity. The Senate, formerly an advisory council to the king, now became the central organ of governance. Composed of roughly 300 patres, or heads of noble households, it directed foreign policy, finance, and religion. The Senate did not legislate in the modern sense, but its decrees, senatus consulta, carried moral and political authority. In a society where legitimacy derived from tradition, mos maiorum, the Senate embodied memory, the collective experience of the city's leading families. Citizen participation was organized through assemblies, comitia, though their democratic character was limited. The comitia curiata, the oldest assembly, confirmed magistrates and witnessed religious acts. The more complex comitia centuriata, attributed to Servius Tullius' earlier reforms, elected consuls and praetors according to a property-based classification. In this system, wealth equaled weight. The first classes, composed of Rome's richest citizens, held the majority of voting centuries. The poorest, the proletarii, were grouped into a single unit, effectively voiceless in state affairs. This hierarchy reveals that the Republic was born not from equality but from structured imbalance. Interpretively, The early republic represents an aristocratic experiment in constitutional design. It replaced monarchy with an oligarchy of office holders, a system that emphasized rotation, restraint, and custom over codified law. Historians such as Polybius and Livy later portrayed this balance as the foundation of Rome's greatness. A mixed constitution combining monarchical command, in the consuls, aristocratic deliberation, in the Senate, and popular assent, in the assemblies. Yet, these descriptions likely reflect later idealization. The Republic of the 5th century BCE was less an equilibrium of classes than a compact among elites. Its purpose was stability, not representation. Archaeological data from the early Republican period, including inscriptions and urban projects, indicate a gradual rather than abrupt transition. The Royal Regia on the Via Sacra remained a center of religious administration. The Pontifex Maximus and Rex Sacrorum continued rituals once performed by the kings, ensuring continuity in Rome's sacred calendar. Public works such as the restoration of city walls and the early temple of Jupiter Capitolinus continued under the new regime, financed and supervised by magistrates rather than monarchs. These continuities illustrate a defining Roman characteristic: reform through adaptation rather than rupture. At the same time, the Republic's creation institutionalized hierarchy. The patricii, hereditary descendants of Rome's oldest families, monopolized public office and priesthoods. Their authority was reinforced through ancestral prestige and ritual exclusivity. The plebeians, who comprised the majority of citizens, were excluded from political decision-making and from intermarriage with patrician lineages. Thus, while the Republic abolished kingship, it preserved the social stratification that monarchy had once embodied. One of the most distinctive features of the new system was its reliance on unwritten norms, mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. These traditions defined everything from political procedure to moral behavior. Without formal constitutional documents, the Republic functioned through precedent and consensus. This reliance on collective memory was both strength and vulnerability. It allowed flexibility in crisis but also depended on shared restraint among elites. Later Roman writers often credited this self-discipline, the capacity of men to yield authority when their term ended, as the moral foundation of the early Republic. Interpretively, the Republic's emergence illustrates a transition from divine kingship to civic trust. Power was no longer understood as a personal inheritance sanctioned by the gods, but as a temporary duty conferred by citizens and bounded by law. Yet, the sacred dimension did not disappear. Each magistrate's imperium was still ritually ratified through auspices, and the Senate maintained the role of custodian of the gods' favor, pax deorum. Religion thus remained a stabilizing force, legitimizing political authority while framing it within ritual limits. The early Republic's foreign policy also reflected this cautious balance. Rome's leaders avoided aggressive expansion in the first decades after 509 BCE, focusing instead on securing alliances and defending against Etruscan and Latin rivals. Records preserved by later annalists describe conflicts with the Etruscan king Lars Porsena, who briefly besieged the city but ultimately withdrew, an event that became foundational to Roman patriotic legend. Whether historical or not, these narratives served to portray the Republic as resilient and self-reliant, defended by citizens rather than commanded by kings. The socio-political structure that emerged from this formative century was remarkably durable. By dividing power among multiple institutions, Rome reduced the risk of tyranny but introduced new forms of competition. Political advancement became dependent on public reputation, military achievement, and the favor of peers. The Republic, in effect, converted ambition into an engine of governance. This system, however, contained inherent tension. As offices multiplied and prestige became the currency of politics, rivalry among elites intensified. By the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, this imbalance began to manifest in social conflict. The plebeians, excluded from meaningful representation, sought legal and economic reforms. Their demands for equality would soon force the Republic to redefine its principles. What began as a safeguard against kingship would evolve into a centuries-long negotiation over rights, privilege and participation, the conflict of the orders. But equality was only nominal. Rome's freedom soon divided along social lines. The same system that ended kingship would now confront its first internal test. The early republic's promise of freedom was unevenly distributed. Beneath the new institutions, social divisions deepened between the patrician elite, descendants of the city's aristocratic lineages, and the plebeians, who formed the backbone of the army and economy but lacked political voice. Contemporary analysis of Livius of Urbe Condita and Dionysius of Halicarnassus suggests that this tension was not an abrupt class war but a gradual negotiation for rights within a rigid social order. The patricians monopolized priesthoods, magistracies, and senatorial membership. The plebeians, excluded from these avenues, relied on collective action to exert pressure. By 494 BCE, sustained economic hardship and debt bondage sparked a mass withdrawal of plebeians to the Mons Sacer, the Sacred Mount. This act of secession, a remarkable form of civil resistance, forced the Senate to compromise. According to later tradition, the Lex Sacrata established the tribunes of the plebs, officials sacrosanct in person, empowered to veto acts harmful to the common citizen. Archaeological data from the early 5th century BCE, though limited, confirms growing urban stratification and expansion of civic institutions consistent with this evolving class dynamic. The establishment of the tribunate introduced a critical principle: legal intercession as a mechanism for balancing power. Though still confined within aristocratic oversight, the tribunes symbolized an emerging civic consciousness, the idea that authority could be checked from below. This shift paralleled wider Mediterranean developments. In Athens, Solon's reforms had similarly redefined citizenship and justice, reflecting a regional movement toward codified civic identity rather than hereditary privilege. 2 decades later, the plebeians demanded transparency in law. Before the 12 Tables, legal rulings were largely oral and monopolized by patrician pontiffs, allowing interpretation to serve elite interests. The creation of the Decemviri, a commission of 10 men, to inscribe the laws publicly on bronze tablets in the Forum represented a turning point. Although Livy describes the process through moralized narrative, modern scholars interpret it as a significant step toward procedural equity. The 12 Tables standardized penalties, property rights, and familial authority, revealing Rome's effort to reconcile tradition with formal governance. This codification had deep structural implications. It established that the law, not lineage, was the reference point for justice, though the system still privileged wealth and status. The prohibition of intermarriage between patricians and plebeians, Table 11, reinforced social boundaries. Yet the very existence of written law allowed future generations to challenge them. Legal historians often regard the 12 Tables as both conservative and revolutionary. Conservative in preserving hierarchy, revolutionary in institutionalizing predictability. By the mid-5th century BCE, plebeian agitation continued through periodic secessions and strikes. Debt slavery, unequal land distribution, and lack of access to magistracies sustained conflict. Each crisis yielded small but cumulative advances: the right of appeal, provocatio ad populum, recognition of the concilium plebis, plebeian assembly, and eventual codification of plebiscites as binding. The Republic's resilience lay in this pattern of concession through confrontation. Interpretively, the struggle of the orders illustrates how Rome's political evolution was driven less by ideology than by pragmatic adaptation. Rather than overthrowing hierarchy, the plebeians sought inclusion within it, shaping a uniquely Roman model of integration. The Republic's legitimacy grew not from equality, but from its capacity to absorb dissent into structure. Archaeologists note that during this same period, civic architecture expanded. The Forum became more organized, temples multiplied, and monumental inscriptions appeared, all indicators of a state consolidating its civic identity through shared space and law. By the close of the 5th century BCE, Rome had achieved a measure of internal equilibrium. The creation of representative offices, written statutes, and participatory assemblies transformed the Republic from a patrician oligarchy into a flexible civic organism. Yet these compromises came at a cost. The Republic's stability now depended on continual negotiation between classes. By the end of this formative period, Rome had secured internal cohesion, just as external challenges began to emerge. The city's new institutions would soon be tested on the battlefield, as Rome extended its authority over the Latin and Etruscan world. Rome's early republic was not founded on a single constitutional blueprint. Instead, it grew through a gradual process of adaptation, as precedent and necessity shaped its political organs. In the aftermath of monarchy, the Romans established a system that avoided permanent concentration of power. Each magistracy embodied restraint, authority limited by time, colleagues, and accountability. This architecture of balance was not theoretical, but the cumulative product of experience. At the center of the system stood the consuls, two magistrates elected annually by the comitia centuriata. Holding imperium, they commanded armies, convened the Senate, and executed the state's decisions. Yet they were bound by collegiality, neither could act unilaterally, and by the expectation that their authority would end after 1 year. Inscriptions from later centuries, such as the Fasti Capitolini, trace this succession of consuls, symbolizing continuity in rotation. The annual cycle reinforced the republic's anti-monarchical ethos. Power was transient, not hereditary. Beneath the consuls, new offices developed to manage an increasingly complex state. The quaestors, originally financial assistants to the consuls, handled the public treasury, or aerarium saturni. The praetors, first introduced in the 4th century BCE, oversaw civil law, acting as judges and guarantors of justice. The censors, elected every 5 years, conducted the census, assessed citizens' property, and maintained public morality, a reflection of Rome's fusion of civic duty and moral order. These magistracies demonstrated Rome's pragmatic layering of function. When administrative needs grew, new offices were created rather than reconfiguring the old. Above these rotating magistrates stood the Senate, the enduring core of Roman governance. Its authority, auctoritas senatus, was not defined by law but by prestige. Comprised primarily of ex-magistrates and elder statesmen, it wielded advisory power that shaped all major policy. The Senate's influence rested on continuity and memory. Unlike the ephemeral magistracies, it provided institutional permanence, linking generations through shared deliberation. Archaeological excavations of the Curia Hostilia site reveal successive phases of reconstruction, underscoring the Senate's physical and symbolic endurance as Rome's political heart. The Republic's genius lay in this distribution of power, what Polybius later called its mixed constitution. Legislative, executive, and aristocratic elements coexisted without clear separation but with reciprocal dependence. The assemblies could elect magistrates and pass laws, the magistrates executed policy, and the Senate guided through precedent. This structure allowed adaptation without revolution. When new challenges arose, wars, internal crises, or administrative strain, the Romans responded not by rewriting their constitution but by adjusting its mechanisms. A striking example of such adaptation was the creation of the dictatorship. In times of existential threat, a single magistrate could be appointed with supreme authority for up to 6 months. The first recorded dictator, Titus Larsius, 501 BCE, illustrates the Republic's delicate balance between fear of monarchy and recognition of emergency necessity. The office existed not to revive kingship, but to ensure unity of command under extraordinary conditions. Its voluntary expiration after success reaffirmed the supremacy of law over personal rule. Later historians, including Livy, portrayed the dictatorship as a safeguard of the Republic's resilience, an instrument of stability, not despotism. Interpretively, this early phase demonstrates how Rome's institutions were conservative yet flexible. They evolved incrementally through precedent, avoiding theoretical codification. Each reform addressed immediate practical needs but became embedded as custom. The absence of a written constitution did not imply weakness. Rather, it allowed the system to absorb crisis without formal revision. Modern scholars often note that Rome's political culture valued continuity over innovation, a preference that gave its institutions remarkable longevity. The Senate's dominance, however, ensured that the republic remained oligarchic in character. Patrician families monopolized magistracies and priesthoods, preserving political exclusivity. This structure was justified by the concept of mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, which sacralized social hierarchy as the foundation of order. Inscriptions, genealogies, and family monuments from the Forum and Capitoline Hill attest to this intertwining of lineage and legitimacy. Power, though nominally elective, circulated within a narrow aristocratic network. By the mid-5th century BCE, Rome's governmental machinery had matured into a coherent framework. Consuls led armies, praetors dispensed justice, quaestors managed finances, and censors maintained civic integrity. The Senate advised and stabilized, while assemblies sanctioned decisions through ritualized participation. This layered structure transformed Rome from a city-state recovering from monarchy into a disciplined polity capable of sustained expansion. As Rome's political framework settled into equilibrium, its leaders turned outward. The same institutions that maintained domestic order would now direct the republic's energies toward the conquest and integration of Italy. The early Roman Republic was not merely a contest of arms or offices, it was a prolonged negotiation over the meaning of citizenship itself. During the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Rome's social fabric was strained by conflict between its two primary orders: the patricians, descendants of the early senatorial families, and the plebeians, the broader mass of citizens who lacked formal political rights. The Republic's survival depended on how this divide was managed, not abolished. Through gradual, cumulative reform, the plebeians transformed exclusion into representation, and their victories became the backbone of Roman constitutional culture. The first instrument of plebeian power was collective withdrawal, the secessio plebis. In 494 BCE, faced with debt slavery, arbitrary arrest, and legal impotence, plebeian soldiers refused to serve and retreated to the Sacred Mount. Ancient sources such as Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus describe this act not as rebellion but as self-defense. The plebeians suspended participation in the state until they gained protection within it. Their success led to the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, officials endowed with sacrosanctitas, legal inviolability, and the right to veto actions harmful to the plebeian order. This innovation, blending religion and politics, institutionalized dissent within the Republic. By establishing an office capable of checking patrician magistrates, Rome gave opposition a legitimate constitutional form. Subsequent generations extended these rights through negotiation rather than upheaval. The Lex Canulia of 445 BCE legalized intermarriage between patricians and plebeians, dissolving the social barrier that had perpetuated political inequality. This measure reflected Rome's pragmatic approach to reform. By integrating capable plebeians into the elite through family alliances, the Senate preserved unity while expanding legitimacy. Archaeological evidence of mixed elite burials and shared family cults from the mid-5th century supports this gradual social blending. The next major advance came with the Liciniosextian laws of 367 BCE. Proposed by the tribunes Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius Lateranus after a decade of political obstruction. These laws attacked both economic and political inequality. They limited the amount of public land, ager publicus, any citizen could occupy, addressed debt relief, and, most importantly, opened the consulship to plebeians. The first plebeian consul, Lucius Sextius Lateranus, took office in 366 BCE, marking a structural milestone. The highest magistracy was no longer monopolized by birth. Polybius later identified this reform as the point when the Republic's balance between orders was permanently stabilized. Interpretively, the reforms of this period illustrate how Rome's constitution matured through negotiated adaptation, not ideological revolution. Each concession granted to the plebeians was both a victory and a reinforcement of the system's stability. By integrating opposition rather than suppressing it, the Republic avoided the cycles of civil war that destabilized many contemporaneous city-states. The Concilium Plebis, the plebeian assembly, became a parallel legislative body whose resolutions, plebiscita, gradually acquired the force of law. The Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE, though beyond this section's time frame, would later confirm this equality, the culmination of a century-long evolution. Archaeological data from early Republican strata, including domestic architecture and burial patterns, reveal an emerging economic stratification even as political rights expanded. Wealthier plebeians rose through commerce, land acquisition, and military distinction, forming a new hybrid elite known as the nobiles, families whose ancestors had achieved high office, regardless of origin. This development underscores a central paradox of the Republic. While access broadened, concentration of wealth and power persisted. Political equality did not dissolve hierarchy. It reorganized it. In practice, the Republic after 367 BCE functioned as an aristocratic meritocracy, governed by those who combined lineage, wealth, and military service. The rotation of magistracies, now accessible to both orders, provided mobility but also reinforced exclusivity. Offices remained unpaid, limiting participation to those of means. Nonetheless, the integration of plebeians into high office fostered a sense of civic unity that became a defining Roman value, the idea that compromise, not conflict, secured the state. With domestic equilibrium secured and its citizens united under shared institutions, Rome now directed its collective energy outward, toward the conquest and integration of the Italian peninsula. By the late 5th century BCE, Rome's internal balance had stabilized sufficiently for it to project power beyond its walls. The Republic's early wars in Latium and central Italy were not isolated skirmishes but the crucible in which its military, political, and logistical systems were forged. These conflicts with the Volsci, Equi, Etruscans, and Sabines transformed Rome from a regional participant into the dominant power of Latium. Archaeological, epigraphic, and literary evidence together illustrate a period of consolidation, one that blended warfare, diplomacy, and infrastructure into a coherent model of expansion that would later define the Roman Empire itself. The first organized framework for Roman regional influence appeared with the Foedus Cassianum, a mutual defense treaty between Rome and the Latin League, traditionally dated to 493 BCE. According to Livy, this treaty, negotiated by the consul Spurius Cassius Vessilinus, established equality between Rome and its Latin neighbors. Yet, in practice, the balance was already tilting toward Roman preeminence. The Foedus created a joint military command structure but placed Roman magistrates at its head, foreshadowing Rome's strategy of control through alliance rather than annexation. Archaeological corroboration, including shared weapon typologies and Latin inscriptions across fortified sites, supports the interpretation of a coordinated defense system centered on Rome's leadership. Rome's conflicts with the Volsci and Equi, fierce hill tribes to the southeast, dominated much of the 5th century BCE. These campaigns were seasonal and protracted, reflecting the limitations of early Republican logistics. Nonetheless, the Romans developed a systematic method of warfare, annual levies of citizen soldiers organized by wealth and class under the comitia centuriata, ensuring that military service was integrated with civic duty. The persistence of these conflicts compelled institutional endurance. As Livy records, the wars with the Volsci and Equi taught Rome the art of never yielding its ground. The capture of Veii in 396 BCE marked a decisive transformation in Roman power. Veii, a major Etruscan city situated just 16 kilometers north of Rome, represented both an economic rival and a cultural counterpart. Its decade-long siege, led by the dictator Marcus Furius Camillus, culminated in Rome's first major annexation of foreign territory. Excavations at Veii's Porta Ponte Soto and temple complexes confirm violent destruction consistent with Livy's narrative, while the distribution of Roman-style artifacts afterward suggests rapid cultural assimilation. The conquest doubled Rome's territory, introduced permanent garrisons, and yielded immense spoils that funded civic and religious projects. Interpretively, Veii's fall marked more than a military victory. It inaugurated Rome's model of expansion by incorporation. Rather than destroying conquered peoples, Rome often extended partial citizenship or created dependent alliances, integrating them into a growing network of obligations. This approach provided manpower and stability, ensuring that each conquest strengthened the republic rather than overextending it. The colonial system, small settlements of Roman and Latin citizens planted on strategic sites, reinforced this network. Early colonies such as Ostia, Antium, and Signia served as both defensive outposts and instruments of cultural integration. Archaeological remains from these sites reveal standardized urban layouts, roads, and temples mirroring those of Rome itself, early signs of deliberate replication of Roman order. The infrastructure that connected these territories reflected Rome's commitment to administrative cohesion. Roads like the Via Salaria, Salt Road, and early phases of the Via Latina facilitated troop movement and trade, binding rural and urban Italy. The construction of permanent fortifications, bridges, and drainage works, many attributed to Camillus' post-war reforms, indicate state-directed resource coordination. Rome's capacity to organize labor and logistics, rooted in its republican institutions, became a decisive factor in its rise. Analytically, this era reveals that Rome's warfare was not purely territorial, it was institutionalized statecraft. The Republic's assemblies financed wars, consuls commanded them, and the Senate oversaw alliances. This unity of civil and military policy distinguished Rome from neighboring polities, where leadership was often temporary or factional. Rome's system allowed continuous mobilization without systemic collapse. The residential publica functioned as a self-reinforcing machine. Military success generated wealth, which funded further campaigns, which in turn legitimized the political order. By the mid-4th century BCE, Rome had subdued or allied most of Latium. The Latin League, once an association of peers, was now subordinated through bilateral treaties, each city tied to Rome rather than to one another. This pattern, divide, ally, incorporate, became a recurring template for future expansion. Rome's leadership was accepted not because it was imposed by terror, but because it delivered security, infrastructure, and shared prosperity. With Latium secure and Veii subdued, Rome now faced a new test: survival against greater powers of Italy. The river Allia ran red with Roman blood. On a summer's day in 390 BCE, the Republic, scarcely a century old, met a people they neither understood nor respected: the Gauls. These warriors, tall, pale-haired, and clad in iron and gold, descended from the north, answering neither law nor diplomacy. Livy tells us that when the Roman army broke and fled, the citizens themselves looked on in disbelief as the Gauls entered the city, unopposed, unchallenged, and unstoppable. Rome burned. The sacred houses of the gods fell to ash. The Senate hid within the Capitoline Hill, besieged, while the rest of the city was stripped and slaughtered. It was not merely a military defeat, it was an existential wound. For centuries, Romans would remember the Dies Alliensis, the day of the Allia, as one of ill omen, a stain upon the calendar itself. Yet, amid the ruin, the Republic did not die. Transformed. Later Roman writers, especially Livy and Plutarch, portray the sack as a test of divine favor, a trial by fire from which Rome emerged purified. Archaeology supports at least part of the tale. Burn layers across the Forum and Palatine, abrupt construction phases in the early 4th century, and debris consistent with destruction by fire. Whether the Gauls truly occupied the whole city or not, the psychological shock was real. Rome, a city that believed itself chosen, had been humbled by barbarians. The Romans' response was not despair, but reconstruction. Camillus, recalled from exile according to tradition, became the second founder of Rome. Whether or not his exploits are exaggerated, his legend reveals how Romans chose to interpret defeat. He supposedly rallied the survivors, defeated the Gauls in a symbolic counterattack, and refused the Senate's proposal to abandon the ruins for Veii. Rome is not her walls, Livy imagines him saying, but her people. The physical recovery was rapid. By the mid-4th century BCE, new fortifications, the Servian Wall, encircled the city, its tufa blocks still visible today on the Aventine and Esquiline. Rome's urban plan was irregular, almost chaotic, a reflection of speed over order. Yet this reconstruction also symbolizes Roman pragmatism, function before form. Economically, the sack disrupted trade and agriculture, but it also spurred innovation. Surviving records mention emergency land redistribution, debt relief, and state-led construction. These actions foreshadowed later Roman responses to crisis: pragmatic, unsentimental, and collective. Politically, the trauma strengthened unity. The Senate's prestige rose. Its survival during the siege became proof of divine protection and institutional endurance. Plebeian-patrician conflicts, though far from over, quieted temporarily in the shared effort of rebuilding. Perhaps the most lasting transformation came in the field. The pre-Gallic Roman army had been a hoplite phalanx, rigid, suited for flat plains, and easily outmaneuvered by lighter foes. The defeat revealed its limitations. In the following decades, Rome developed the manipular legion. Smaller, flexible units divided by age and experience, hastati, principes, and triarii. This structure allowed movement in broken terrain, decentralized command, and tactical depth. Scholars such as Cornell and Oakley interpret this not as a single reform but as an evolution born from necessity. The manipular system became the backbone of Roman conquest for centuries to come. Discipline, adaptability, and relentless organization. These were the new Roman virtues. The Gallic sack also reshaped Rome's relationship with the divine. The Senate rededicated temples, revived ancient rituals, and emphasized pietas, dutiful respect toward gods and ancestors. The Capitoline Triad, especially Jupiter Optimus Maximus, came to embody the idea that divine favor could be regained through perseverance. In the collective memory, the sack became a moral parable. Rome's pride had brought ruin, but humility and faith had brought rebirth. This moral framing would echo through centuries of Roman identity. Cicero, writing 300 years later, still cited the sack as proof that fortune favored the steadfast. By 380 BCE, the Republic had reemerged stronger than before. Its walls were higher, its legions more disciplined, its institutions more cohesive. The trauma at the Allia had burned away complacency and replaced it with an almost pathological drive for security. Every later Roman campaign, every fort, every colony, every treaty, bore the shadow of that humiliation. Rome's leaders vowed that never again would the city be unprepared, undefended, or divided. Defeat had become a teacher, and its lesson would echo across the Italian peninsula. From ashes, Rome learned endurance and turned disaster into destiny. Rebuilt and rearmed, Rome soon faced its greatest challenge: the struggle for mastery of Italy. When the smoke of the Gallic fires had faded, Rome turned south, into a landscape of fertile valleys, volcanic plains, and rugged mountains. There, beyond Campania's gentle coast, lay the upland strongholds of the Samnites. Fierce, independent tribes whose warriors fought for freedom, not empire. Between 343 and 290 BCE, the clash between Rome and Samnium would define Italy's political future and permanently alter the nature of Roman warfare. The Samnites were not barbarians. They were highland Italic peoples, Oscan-speaking, bound by kinship and loose federation rather than centralized state. Their homeland, Samnium, stretched across the Apennines, commanding vital passes and fertile uplands. To control Italy, Rome had to break Samnite resistance. The first confrontation began in 343 BCE, when the wealthy city of Capua, under threat from Samnite raiders, appealed to Rome for aid. Intervention drew the Republic into a regional war far beyond its immediate interest. Livy dramatizes Rome's decision as a test of destiny, whether to remain a city-state or embrace imperial responsibility. The First Samnite War, 343 to 341 BCE, was brief and largely indecisive. Roman armies, still operating in traditional phalanx formations, struggled in the rough terrain. Victory at Mount Gaurus won prestige, but geography favored the Samnites, who vanished into mountain redoubts after each engagement. When the Latin allies revolted soon after, Rome withdrew, its attention divided, its ambitions unfulfilled. 2 decades later, the conflict reignited. The Second Samnite War became one of the longest and most formative in Republican history. Rome's attempt to expand into Apulia, a region bordering Samnium, provoked fierce resistance. The Samnites struck back with guerrilla precision, drawing the Romans into mountain passes where discipline and formation meant little. In 321 BCE came disaster. At the Caudine Forks, a narrow defile in the Apennines, a Roman army was trapped and forced to surrender without a fight. The defeated soldiers, stripped of weapons and made to pass under the yoke, returned to Rome humiliated. Ancient sources, particularly Livy, present this as a moral nadir, a lesson in humility and endurance. The Senate refused to accept the terms of surrender, asserting that dishonor could not bind the Republic. Rome vowed revenge. But the true response was reform, not rage. The rigid hoplite phalanx, suitable for the plains of Latium, gave way to a new system, the manipular legion. In this structure, soldiers were divided into small, semi-independent units, maniples, arranged in a checkerboard pattern, allowing flexibility, rotation, and coordinated maneuvering on uneven ground. Each maniple could advance or retreat independently, transforming the Roman army from a solid wall into a living, breathing machine of coordinated motion. This innovation, alongside logistical improvements like fortified camps, castra, and the appointment of permanent military tribunes, made Rome uniquely adaptable. The Republic could now fight in mountains, forests, or plains anywhere under any condition. War with the Samnites also brought a revolution in infrastructure. To move armies across southern Italy, Rome began constructing permanent roads, arteries of conquest that doubled as tools of integration. The most famous, the Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, connected Rome to Capua and later to Brundisium. The Via Appia was more than engineering. It was a statement of intent, a tangible line of Roman power cutting through the heart of Italy. Along these routes, colonies were planted, Latin settlements of veterans and citizens who secured conquered regions. Towns like Callus, Luceria, and Venusia became anchors of Roman control and hubs of cultural assimilation. Through colonization and alliance treaties, the Republic created what historians now call the federation system, a web of subordinate but loyal communities bound by treaty, foedus. Each ally provided troops, taxes, and local stability in exchange for autonomy. It was not equality, but it was durable, a network strong enough to survive defeat and flexible enough to expand without empire building in name. The Third Samnite War, 298 to 290 BCE, brought the final reckoning. This time, the Samnites forged alliances with Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls, a coalition aimed at stopping Roman hegemony before it spread across the peninsula. The scale of conflict grew immense, testing the Republic's ability to wage simultaneous campaigns on multiple fronts. At Centenum, 295 BCE, a decisive engagement unfolded. Roman consuls Quintus Fabius Relianus and Publius Decius Mus faced the combined army of Samnites and Gauls. The battle was ferocious. Ancient accounts describe Decius Mus performing devotio, sacrificing himself by charging into enemy lines to invoke divine favor for Rome. The Romans prevailed, but only narrowly, and at great cost. After Centenum, resistance collapsed piecemeal. The final campaigns between 291 and 290 BCE were brutal counterinsurgencies through mountain strongholds. When the dust settled, Samnium was pacified, not through annihilation, but through exhaustion and integration. Rome had learned to absorb its enemies. Many Samnites were later enrolled as allies, serving in the very legions that had once fought them. What defined Rome's victory was not brilliance in battle, but endurance in policy. The Senate's capacity for continuity, maintaining direction across decades and consular turnovers, gave Rome a strategic coherence unmatched in Italy. Each defeat was analyzed, adapted to, and ultimately reversed. The wars also crystallized Rome's civic identity. The citizen-soldier ideal reached maturity. Every Roman fought not as a mercenary but as a stakeholder in the Republic's destiny. Service, sacrifice, and discipline became cultural expectations. Defeat at the Caudine Forks was remembered, but not as shame, as the crucible that had tested and proven Rome's resolve. By 290 BCE, Rome's alliances stretched from Etruria to the southern coasts. The Republic controlled the heart of Italy, not as an empire of conquest, but as a web of loyalty, obligation, and shared interest. In the mountains of Italy, Rome forged not just victories, but the system that would conquer the world. With the Samnites subdued, Rome's web of alliances now spanned the peninsula, setting the stage for a unified Italy. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had achieved what no city-state in Italy ever had. Not simply domination, but cohesion. The Republic presided over a mosaic of peoples, languages, and traditions that stretched from the Po Valley to the Straits of Messina. Yet this was no empire of subjugation. Rome's control rested on something subtler, a framework of law, alliance, and obligation that transformed Italy into a single political organism without erasing its diversity. After the Samnite Wars, Rome faced a new challenge: how to sustain power across vast distances without a standing army of occupation. The answer was a federative system, a network of treaties, foedera, binding each community to Rome individually, not collectively. The socii, or allies, retained local autonomy, their own councils and magistrates, and often their native languages. Yet, in exchange for protection and partnership, they were bound to supply troops when called upon. Each treaty was tailored. Some granted full citizenship rights, civitas optimo iure, others partial, civitas sine suffragio, and some only formal alliance without voting privileges. This tiered structure created what Polybius would later call a system of mutual dependence without equality. Rome stood at the center, not as overlord but as the pivot around which every other state revolved. Two institutions gave the Republic its enduring administrative backbone: the municipium and the colonia. A municipium was a pre-existing Italian town incorporated into the Roman system. Its inhabitants became partial citizens, obligated to military service but lacking full suffrage in Rome. Over time, many municipia gained expanded rights, evolving into near-equal partners in the civic body. The colonia, by contrast, was a Roman creation, a settlement of citizens or veterans planted in strategic locations. Colonies like Callus, Venusia, and Ariminum served as fortified outposts, trade centers, and instruments of cultural diffusion. Their grids followed Roman town planning: a central forum, Cardo and Decumanus streets, temples aligned to Roman deities. In architecture and administration alike, they replicated Rome itself. Each colony functioned as a miniature Rome, a node of Latin law and identity radiating outward across the peninsula. Through them, Roman speech, coinage, and customs spread more effectively than through conquest alone. What bound this patchwork together was infrastructure: physical, legal, and cultural. The Via Appia stretched from Rome to Brundisium, linking the capital with the Adriatic coast. The Via Flaminia reached northward to Ariminum. These stone arteries allowed troops, merchants, and messengers to traverse Italy with unprecedented speed. Alongside the roads came law, Rome's most powerful export. The 12 Tables and the evolving corpus of customary and civic law provided a shared legal framework. Latin became the administrative language, spreading through inscriptions, treaties, and trade. Weights, measures, and coinage were standardized. Religious practices synchronized through the worship of shared gods, often blending Roman forms with local traditions. Archaeological evidence from Campania, Latium, and Umbria shows early hybrid sanctuaries, local shrines rebuilt in Roman style, signaling both subordination and synthesis. In effect, Rome built not just an empire of roads and fortresses, but one of ideas and institutions. Every new ally learned Roman procedure, elections, contracts, magistracies, and began mirroring the Republic's political forms on a smaller scale. This federative system, though asymmetrical, bred a remarkable stability. Whereas other Mediterranean powers, like Carthage or the Hellenistic monarchies, ruled through garrisons and tribute, Rome ruled through obligation and shared interest. The allies, socii, contributed the bulk of the Republic's military manpower. In the wars to come, especially against Pyrrhus and Carthage. As much as two-thirds of Roman armies would be drawn from allied contingents. The reward for service was security, prestige, and eventual incorporation. The Senate's genius lay in moderation. Allies were rarely plundered or enslaved. Instead, Rome offered a vision of partnership under its leadership. To rebel against Rome was to rebel against a system that, paradoxically, offered more order and prosperity than independence ever had. This arrangement was not entirely altruistic. The distribution of citizenship ensured that while the burdens of war were shared, the political privileges were concentrated in Rome. Allied soldiers bled for a republic whose elections they could not influence. This imbalance, though tolerated for centuries, planted the first seeds of the Social War, 91 to 88 BCE, when Italy's allies would demand the citizenship long denied to them. Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, marveled at the system's resilience. In his histories, he attributes Rome's supremacy not to fortune or ferocity, but to its federative genius, the ability to make allies rather than subjects. Where other empires fell apart under rebellion, Rome expanded through willing cooperation. Modern archaeology supports this assessment. Settlement surveys reveal increasing urban uniformity across Italy, similar layouts, coinage, and burial customs. Cultural Romanization was not imposed. It evolved through interaction, trade, and intermarriage. The political anthropologist might call this a nested hierarchy, a structure in which loyalty and identity were layered, not replaced. One could be Samnite or Etruscan, Latin or Umbrian, and still Roman in obligation. By 264 BCE, the Republic ruled an Italy united not by walls, but by roads and law. No other ancient polity achieved such integration without central bureaucracy or standing armies of occupation. Rome's formula, local autonomy under overarching sovereignty, allowed scale without strain. Yet within this success lay contradiction. The very system that unified Italy also froze its inequalities. Citizenship became both a privilege and a prize, a measure of Rome's generosity and its control. Still, the achievement was monumental. A peninsula transformed into a cohesive political ecosystem. When Rome next looked outward, across the narrow sea toward Carthage, it did so as the undisputed master of Italy, commanding the manpower and loyalty of millions. Rome ruled Italy not by chains, but by contracts, a republic of conquest held together by law. With Italy unified under Roman leadership, the republic now faced its first trans-Mediterranean rival, Carthage. When Rome first intervened in Sicily in 264 BCE, its leaders viewed the mission as a limited expedition, a pragmatic defense of Italian interests. Yet within a generation, this seemingly small entanglement evolved into a 23-year struggle that reshaped the Republic's military, economy, and political identity. Known later as the First Punic War, it was the first time Rome projected sustained power beyond the Italian peninsula. The spark ignited in Messana, a strategic city controlling the Strait of Messina. Greek mercenaries, the Mamertines, sought Rome's aid against Carthage, which had long maintained influence across Sicily through trade and garrisons. The Roman Senate hesitated. Intervention in Sicily risked provoking a major naval power, but the Comitia Centuriata voted for action, marking the Republic's first step toward overseas war. Carthage, founded by Phoenician colonists centuries earlier, possessed the Mediterranean's largest navy. Its strength lay in maritime trade, fortified harbors, and skilled sailors drawn from its North African, Iberian, and Punic colonies. Rome, by contrast, had never fought a major naval engagement. The Republic's military tradition was terrestrial, disciplined legions trained for land battles across Italy's rugged terrain. But Rome's leaders quickly grasped the strategic necessity of adaptation. If Carthage ruled the sea, Sicily could not be held. Thus began one of the most remarkable transformations in ancient military history, the birth of a navy virtually from nothing. Ancient historians describe the moment with awe. Polybius recounts that Rome, having captured a wrecked Carthaginian quinquireme, used it as a prototype for mass production. Within months, Roman shipyards along the Tiber constructed an entire fleet. The scale of this industrial mobilization, tens of thousands of oarsmen trained simultaneously, demonstrated the Republic's organizational discipline and social resilience. Rome's naval innovation was not limited to replication. Recognizing Carthaginian superiority in maneuver and seamanship, Roman commanders sought to redefine the battlefield itself. The corvus, a boarding bridge fitted with an iron spike, allowed Roman soldiers to storm enemy decks as if they were land fortifications. The sea thus became an extension of the battlefield Rome already understood: close-quarters infantry combat. This adaptation changed the war's rhythm. Early Roman victories at Mylae, 260 BCE, and Ecnomus, 256 BCE, showcased how land-based tactics could defeat naval expertise. The Senate and people of Rome, SPQR, celebrated these victories as proof that persistence, discipline, and engineering could overcome experience. Yet success came at immense cost. Naval warfare demanded sustained resource extraction, timber, metal, and manpower on an unprecedented scale. Each quinquereme required hundreds of rowers. The losses from storms often exceeded those from battle. Entire fleets were destroyed off Camarina and Cape Hermium. Still, the Republic rebuilt, treating every disaster as a logistical challenge rather than a deterrent. Carthage, for its part, relied on professional mercenaries and seasoned admirals like Hamilcar Barca. The city's strength lay in endurance at sea and its ability to exploit the geography of Sicily's western harbors. The war's front lines oscillated for decades: sieges of Agrigentum, naval raids, and the shifting loyalties of Sicilian cities that weighed Roman persistence against Carthaginian familiarity. The contrast between the two powers became stark. Carthage fought to preserve a maritime empire. Rome fought to define itself as one. The Senate's capacity to mobilize allies from across Italy, socii who provided ships, men, and grain, demonstrated the effectiveness of the Italian alliance system established in previous centuries. By 242 BCE, after 20 years of stalemate, both powers were exhausted. Carthage's treasury was depleted. Rome's citizens were weary of conscription and taxation. But under the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, Rome assembled one final fleet, financed privately by wealthy citizens, to intercept the Carthaginian supply convoys near the Aegates Islands, west of Sicily. On March 10, 241 BCE, Roman and Carthaginian forces met in a decisive naval battle. Contemporary accounts describe strong winds favoring the lighter Roman ships, while Carthage's heavily laden transports were overwhelmed. The Roman crews, now seasoned by years of attrition, fought with coordinated precision. The Carthaginian fleet was annihilated. The peace treaty that followed forced Carthage to withdraw from Sicily, pay an indemnity of 3,200 talents, and acknowledge Roman supremacy in the region. Sicily became Rome's first provincia, an administrative term that would later define its global empire. Victory in the First Punic War transformed Rome from an Italian hegemon into a Mediterranean power. The experience of building, losing, and rebuilding fleets cultivated a national capacity for industrial mobilization and long-term strategic planning. The Republic now possessed permanent naval infrastructure, docks, shipwrights, and administrative offices to manage maritime logistics. The Senate's oversight of provincial governance in Sicily inaugurated a new phase of Roman politics: the management of foreign territories, taxation, and garrisoning far from the Italian homeland. Culturally, the war also redefined Roman identity. The Senate commemorated victory with monumental dedications, temples to Victoria and Neptune, signaling that divine favor had followed Rome beyond its ancestral soil. Sicily's fertile plains and cities like Syracuse and Agrigentum became economic assets, supplying grain that sustained both the Roman populace and future campaigns. Interpretively, this was the Republic's first test of institutional endurance. No single commander dominated the war. Instead, collective governance and procedural continuity triumphed. Where monarchies might have collapsed under similar strain, Rome's distributed authority enabled resilience through rotation and renewal. But triumph carried hidden consequences. The long war had intensified senatorial control of state resources, enriching elite families through war contracts and land acquisition. A new class of publicani, tax farmers and contractors, emerged, signaling the economic shifts that would later fuel social unrest. For Carthage, defeat was not extinction but deferral. The humiliation of indemnities and the loss of Sicily provoked internal rebellion, the mercenary war, and the rise of a new military leader, Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal. He rebuilt Carthaginian fortunes in Spain, preparing for eventual revenge. Rome, meanwhile, entered an era of confidence. Its navy had proven that citizen initiative could master the sea. Its senate had shown that perseverance could outlast wealth and experience. The Republic's political culture absorbed a new lesson, that no challenge, however alien, lay beyond adaptation. By 241 BCE, Rome stood transformed, from landlocked republic to maritime empire. Sicily, once a distant theater of war, was now an administrative possession. The Mediterranean, once Carthage's domain, had become Rome's frontier. For the first time, Roman legions looked beyond Italy and saw an empire waiting at sea. But Carthage, humiliated but unbroken, would soon return, led by a commander whose name became legend. In 218 BCE, the Republic once again found itself at war with Carthage, this time not over Sicily, but over supremacy in the western Mediterranean. The stage was set by the expansion of both powers into the Iberian Peninsula. While Rome consolidated control over northern Italy, Carthage rebuilt its fortunes under Hamilcar Barca and his sons, establishing a new base of wealth in Spain. When the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally, fell to Hannibal, Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War had begun. Hannibal Barca, barely in his late 20s, embodied audacity. To strike at Rome itself, he conceived an invasion through the unthinkable route, across the Alps. With a composite army of Iberians, Numidians, and war elephants, he undertook one of history's most daring marches. Ancient sources, from Polybius to Livy, mix awe with disbelief. Tens of thousands perished in the mountains, yet Hannibal emerged in northern Italy with a force capable of shattering Roman power. The first blows fell swiftly. At the Trebia River, 218 BCE, and Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE, Roman armies were destroyed through ambush and superior maneuver. Livy records Trasimene as a battle more of deceit than of valor, an annihilation in fog and panic. Rome reeled. In the aftermath, the Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, whose cautious strategy of delay earned him the name Cunctator, the delayer. He refused direct engagement, shadowing Hannibal and denying him open battle. Many Romans called him coward. History would later call him prudent. But restraint proved politically untenable. In 216 BCE, eager for decisive victory, the Republic assembled the largest army in its history, over 80,000 men, to confront Hannibal at Cannae. The result was catastrophe. Using a double envelopment tactic unmatched in antiquity, Hannibal encircled and annihilated the Roman army. Estimates suggest over 50,000 citizens died in a single day, senators, officers, and farmers alike. Polybius called it a calamity without parallel. Rome's allies wavered. Capua, the second city of Italy, defected to Carthage. Yet Rome refused to yield. The Senate rejected all peace offers. Citizens sold jewelry to fund the legions. Boys were enlisted before their time. What might have broken other states became, for Rome, a crucible. The Republic transformed endurance into strategy. Over years of attrition, Rome's network of colonies, manpower reserves, and disciplined command structure slowly turned the tide. Hannibal, lacking reinforcements and besieged by loyalty within Italy's walls, became a commander without a state to sustain him. Meanwhile, Roman operations in Iberia, first under the Scipio brothers, and later under Publius Cornelius Scipio, their son, struck at Carthage's economic lifeline. Scipio's campaigns in Spain displayed both innovation and charisma, merging Roman discipline with adaptive tactics learned from his enemy. By 206 BCE, Carthage's Iberian Empire was gone. Scipio, now hailed as Africanus, carried the war into Africa itself. In 202 BCE, at Zama, the two great generals, Scipio and Hannibal, met at last. The battle was hard-fought. Roman infantry held firm while Numidian cavalry, once Hannibal's own allies, turned against him under Masiniss's command. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was stripped of its fleet, its empire, and its independence in foreign affairs. The Second Punic War had lasted 17 years and changed Rome forever. It tested every pillar of the republic, military, civic, and moral. The citizen soldier endured unimaginable losses yet continued to serve. The Senate demonstrated a collective will unmatched in antiquity. The federated Italian allies, though strained, largely held together. Polybius, writing a generation later, concluded that Rome's strength lay not in fortune or generals, but in its constitution, the balance between Senate, magistrates, and people that enabled unity under crisis. Yet victory carried its own transformation. In defeating Carthage, Rome had learned to fight abroad, to govern provinces, and to sustain empire. Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia became sources of grain, silver, and slaves, enriching the aristocracy and widening economic divides. The legions that once defended citizenship now secured profit. The republic that had survived Hannibal would soon face a new struggle against itself. Hannibal showed Rome the limits of courage, and Rome answered with endurance. Target audience insight. Appeals to those captivated by strategy, endurance, and how institutions outlast individuals. The idea that Hannibal's genius met not another man, but a system. Carthage was broken, yet Rome's triumph would bring new perils. Wealth, inequality, and imperial strain. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage was a shadow of its former self, yet not a dead one. Bound by treaty to disarm, it had turned inward, rebuilding its economy through trade and agriculture. Its harbors once again filled with merchant ships. Its markets thrived. But prosperity without power invited suspicion. In Rome, voices of warning grew louder. None more relentless than Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, who ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the subject, with the same refrain: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. To many Romans, Carthage's revival seemed a threat to the moral order itself. It was not that the city had attacked, but that it dared to recover. The Senate, under the pretext of protecting its Numidian ally Massinissa, demanded impossible concessions: the surrender of hostages, weapons, and eventually, the city itself. When Carthage refused to relocate inland, Rome declared war. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was short but merciless. Carthage, though unprepared, resisted with astonishing determination. Men and women labored together to forge weapons from household metal. Temples became arsenals. Polybius, an eyewitness to the campaign, records the grim tenacity of a people fighting for extinction, not victory. The Roman siege, led first by consuls and later by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, dragged on for 3 years. Starvation and fire ravaged the city, but the defenders refused surrender. In 146 BCE, Roman forces finally breached the walls. What followed was systematic destruction. House by house, street by street, the city was burned. According to Appian, the flames consumed Carthage for 17 days. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. This territory was annexed as the province of Africa. The Punic world, that great maritime civilization of Phoenician descent, vanished beneath Roman rule. For Rome, it was the culmination of a century-long struggle. Sicily, Spain, and now Africa stood under its control. The western Mediterranean had become a Roman lake. But the moral cost was profound. What began as a war of security ended as an act of annihilation. Cato's refrain was fulfilled, but at the price of the Republic's innocence. In burning Carthage, Rome revealed a new appetite, not for safety but supremacy. Historians later viewed the war as a threshold moment. The Republic had emerged victorious from existential threats, yet now sought wars of choice. Conquest had become habit, empire its natural horizon. The destruction of Carthage was not merely an end. It was a beginning, the first signal that Rome had crossed from necessity into ambition. As Carthage burned, the Republic crossed an invisible line, from necessity to ambition. Target audience insight. Aimed at viewers drawn to turning points where moral restraint gives way to imperial purpose, when states cease to defend and begin to dominate. With Carthage destroyed, Rome's supremacy in the West was uncontested, but its ambitions would soon turn eastward. When Carthage fell, Rome stood unchallenged in the West, but its horizon had shifted. Across the Adriatic lay the fractured world of Greece and the Hellenistic monarchies, heirs of Alexander's empire. Their wealth, art, and prestige dazzled Roman eyes. Their politics drew Rome, Indiana. What began as diplomacy soon became dominion. The First Macedonian War, 215 to 205 BCE, erupted amid the Second Punic War. Philip V of Macedon, hoping to profit from Rome's struggle with Hannibal, aligned with Carthage. Rome, though exhausted, responded through alliances rather than legions, supporting Greek states like the Aetolian League to contain Macedon. The conflict ended indecisively with the Peace of Phoenix, but it marked a historic shift. Rome had entered the Greek world for the first time. 2 decades later, Macedon's ambitions revived, and so did Rome's. The Second Macedonian War, 200 to 197 BCE, brought Rome face to face with the armies of the successors of Alexander. Under Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a general fluent in Greek culture and rhetoric, the Romans portrayed themselves as champions of freedom, liberators of the Greek polis from monarchic oppression. After a decisive victory at Cynocephaly in 197 BCE, Flamininus stood before the gathered crowds at the Isthmian Games and proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks. Polybius recounts the cheers that followed, a moment when political theater disguised imperial intent. For the Greeks, it seemed a restoration of autonomy. For Rome, it was the perfect illusion of benevolence, freedom under Roman oversight. The Macedonian army, organized in the traditional phalanx, had fallen to the flexibility of the Roman legion, a symbol of the new order. The Hellenistic monarchies, magnificent in ceremony but hollow in structure, had met a state governed by law, citizen duty, and relentless pragmatism. The consequences were far-reaching. The Seleucid Empire, seeking to reclaim its prestige, soon clashed with Rome. Antiochus III, the Great, advanced into Greece, declaring himself protector of Hellenism. The Roman response was swift. In 191 BCE at Thermopylae, the same pass where the Greeks had once faced Persia, Roman legions shattered his army. A year later, at Magnesia, Antiochus suffered final defeat in Asia Minor. The Treaty of Apamea, 188 BCE, confined the Seleucids east of the Taurus Mountains, ending their power in the Aegean. In less than 2 generations, Rome had dismantled the political order that had ruled the eastern Mediterranean for a century and a half. Macedon was reduced to a client kingdom. The Seleucids retreated into decline. Pergamum, Rhodes, and other states courted Roman favor to survive. Even Egypt's Ptolemies now looked westward for protection. The Hellenistic age was not yet over, but it no longer belonged to the heirs of Alexander. Rome, however, still hesitated to govern directly. The Senate preferred influence without annexation. Envoys and commissioners replaced governors. Local rulers were kept in power under Roman guidance. Garrisons and diplomatic missions enforced Roman will more effectively than legions. Tribute flowed not as taxation but as gifts from grateful allies. It was empire without the name. Yet the cultural tide flowed both ways. Contact with Greece transformed Roman identity. Victorious generals brought home not just spoils, but statues, libraries, and philosophers. The austere discipline of the early republic began to mingle with the refinements of Hellenistic luxury. In the Senate, Greek rhetoric became the new language of power. Cato the Elder railed against this softening influence, warning that the conqueror might yet become the conquered in spirit. The Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BCE, confirmed Rome's mastery. Perseus, the last Macedonian king, revived his ancestors' ambitions and rallied Greek discontent against Roman dominance. But at Pydna in 168 BCE, Lucius Aemilius Paulus crushed the Macedonian phalanx in a decisive encounter. The battle's outcome, recorded by both Plutarch and Polybius, symbolized more than a military victory. It marked the end of the Age of Kings. The phalanx, the proud legacy of Alexander, collapsed before the discipline and adaptability of the legion. Macedon was divided into 4 puppet republics. Its royal treasure carried in Paulus' triumph dazzled Rome. The sight of bound kings walking in chains, Perseus among them, announced a new reality. The East, cradle of civilization, now knelt before a city once dismissed as barbarian. But with this triumph came paradox. The Senate, wary of overextension, avoided direct rule. Yet every intervention created dependency. Greek cities that had once cheered Roman liberation soon found themselves ruled by decree from afar. Freedom became form without substance. Rome's victory was total, yet uneasy. In crushing the Hellenistic monarchies, it inherited their world, a world of wealth, bureaucracy, and cultural complexity far beyond the simplicity of the early republic. The Mediterranean, once a mosaic of kingdoms and city-states, had become a Roman sphere of influence. Rome entered Greece as a liberator and left as its master. But conquest brought contradictions. Wealth without reform, luxury without restraint. Rome's conquests in the East reshaped not only its frontiers but its foundations. The republic that had once prided itself on simplicity and civic virtue now found itself awash in foreign wealth. Gold from Macedon, silver from Spain, and tribute from Asia Minor flowed into the treasury, while slaves and luxury goods filled the markets of the capital. For the first time, wealth, not lineage or valor, became the chief measure of power. The transformation began quietly. Victorious generals such as Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Scipio Aemilianus returned from their campaigns not only with military glory but with enormous fortunes. Triumphs displayed unimaginable riches, processions of spoils, exotic captives, and art taken from Greek temples and palaces. Livy and Plutarch both describe these spectacles as moments of pride and unease, symbols of power that hinted at excess. The Senate's elite families, once defined by ancestral service, increasingly invested in trade, land speculation, and provincial contracts. Offices of command and governance became sources of private enrichment. The influx of slaves captured from Greece, Macedonia, and Asia revolutionized the Italian economy. By the mid-2nd century BCE, slaves outnumbered free laborers in several regions of southern Italy. Large estates, or latifundia, replaced the small farms that had sustained the citizen soldier class since the Republic's founding. The latifundia were efficient but destructive to social cohesion. Cheap slave labor drove independent farmers from their land, forcing them into urban poverty or prolonged military service. Archaeological surveys in Etruria and Apulia show widespread rural depopulation in this era, evidence of a countryside absorbed by agrarian capitalism. This economic shift carried deep political consequences. The Roman army, still organized around property qualifications, struggled to recruit free citizens of sufficient means. Those who did serve often returned to find their farms sold or abandoned. In response, many veterans drifted to Rome, swelling the city's population and creating a dependent, restless urban poor. Grain doles and public works became tools of political control, foreshadowing the populist strategies of later centuries. At the same time, provincial administration became a breeding ground for corruption. Governors, often appointed for short terms with little oversight, exploited their positions to extort wealth from subject peoples. Polybius observed that provincial subjects feared Roman taxation more than war itself. The Senate, nominally the guardian of law, rarely intervened. Many senators profited from the same system. Equites, or knightly businessmen, managed tax contracts and commercial ventures across the provinces, forming an economic elite parallel to the political nobility. Rome had created an empire of exploitation without a bureaucracy to govern it. The moral consequences were no less striking. Greek luxury goods, statues, silks, and fine cuisine entered Roman homes, transforming habits once defined by austerity. Greek tutors and philosophers instructed Roman youth, spreading new ethical and artistic ideals but also blurring the old boundaries between virtue and indulgence. Cato the Elder denounced this Hellenization as a corruption of Roman discipline. His origins and speeches warned that foreign influence would dissolve the integrity of the Republic, replacing duty with display. His fears reflected more than xenophobia. They expressed a genuine anxiety that Rome's civic order could not withstand the strain of empire. Social hierarchy hardened even as class barriers blurred. The distinction between patrician and plebeian lost much of its meaning, replaced by a broader divide between nobiles, those with ancestors who had held high office, and the mass of common citizens. Wealth determined status more than birth. New men, homines novae, such as Gaius Marius later on, could rise through merit, but they entered a system increasingly dominated by inherited influence and client networks. Patronage, once a personal bond of loyalty, expanded into a national web of dependency linking the elite to the urban poor and provincial communities alike. Interpretively, this period reveals a fundamental paradox. Success undermined the institutions that produced it. The Republic's political architecture, annual magistracies, collective decision-making, and citizen militias had evolved for a city-state managing neighbors, not provinces. Its informal mechanisms of accountability faltered when stretched across the Mediterranean. Rome could conquer but not yet govern efficiently. The Senate's authority extended over an empire, but its structure remained provincial. The cultural transformation was equally significant. Contact with the Hellenistic world enriched Roman intellectual life. Libraries, art, and philosophy introduced new ideals of humanism, rhetoric, and science. Yet this sophistication coexisted with mounting inequality and violence. The same senators who sponsored Greek philosophers also profited from slave markets. The Republic absorbed Greek culture but ignored Greek lessons in political moderation. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the contradictions of empire had become visible. The concentration of land created economic polarization. The reliance on slaves eroded the base of citizen soldiers, and the influx of wealth fostered competition within the elite rather than unity. The Senate remained powerful but increasingly divided by factionalism and ambition. Scandals over extortion and bribery became routine. The old ethos of mos maiorum, the unwritten code of ancestral virtue, was invoked more often than practiced. Archaeological indicators corroborate this social transformation. Lavish villas in Campania and Latium appear during this period, adorned with Greek mosaics and sculpture. Coin hoards show the monetization of rural life and the growing wealth of a few families. Inscriptions reveal new titles, priesthoods, and honors invented to celebrate elite patrons. The Republic, while formally unchanged, had entered a new phase. An oligarchy enriched by empire, sustained by inequality, and dependent on provincial exploitation. Cato's warnings went unheeded. He died in 149 BCE, the same year Rome embarked on the final war against Carthage, an irony not lost on later historians. Even as Rome destroyed its last rival, it faced the consequences of victory at home. The Republic's external strength masked internal decay. The balance between civic virtue and imperial power was breaking. By the late 2nd century BCE, the symptoms of decline were unmistakable. Landless citizens, indebted farmers, corrupt magistrates, and an urban populace increasingly detached from military service. Reform was inevitable, and would come not from consensus but from conflict. The legions conquered the world, and brought home more than victory. As inequality deepened, the Republic's balance of power faltered, until reform turned revolutionary. In 133 BCE, A young tribune named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus stepped onto the rostra of the Roman Forum and proposed what few dared even to speak: that the land of the Republic, the ager publicus, the public domain, be reclaimed from the wealthy and redistributed to the dispossessed citizens who once formed Rome's strength. His plan was not a revolution in theory, but a restoration in spirit. Yet in practice it struck at the very heart of senatorial privilege. For generations, aristocrats had leased and effectively privatized vast tracts of conquered land. The laws limiting holdings had fallen into disuse. The small farmer, long celebrated as the foundation of Roman virtue and military power, had been displaced by the spread of slave-run estates. Tiberius' proposal sought to reverse this by enforcing old land limits and granting each citizen family a modest allotment, enough to live on, enough to serve. His motive, as ancient sources suggest, was less envy than alarm. Rome's armies were losing their yeoman base. Its citizens were becoming dependents, not defenders. But to the Senate, the measure was an act of sedition. The great landowners stood to lose both wealth and prestige. Tiberius bypassed the Senate altogether, appealing directly to the concilium plebis, the people's assembly, to pass his reforms. This maneuver violated custom, if not law, and shattered the unwritten equilibrium of Roman politics. By taking reform to the masses, Tiberius exposed a new force in Roman life: the populist tribune, wielding the collective will of the people against the entrenched authority of the elite. The reaction was immediate and violent. When one of Tiberius' fellow tribunes vetoed the bill, he had him deposed, a shocking precedent. When the Senate refused to fund his commission, he seized the inheritance of King Attalus III of Pergamon to finance it, another breach of tradition. To his supporters, these acts were bold defenses of justice. To his enemies, they were the signs of tyranny. Rumors spread that he aimed at kingship. On election day for his second tribunate, a mob of senators, led by Publius Scipio Nasica, armed themselves with clubs and furniture legs and stormed the Capitol. In the ensuing chaos, Tiberius was beaten to death along with hundreds of his followers. His body was thrown into the Tiber, the first blood spilled in Rome's internal politics for centuries. The killing of Tiberius Gracchus marked more than the death of a man. It was the death of consensus politics. The Republic's ancient habit of compromise through custom had been replaced by violence. From that point onward, every faction in Rome learned that blood could decide what law could not. A decade later, Gaius Sempronius Gracchus, Tiberius' younger brother, returned to the rostra to complete his brother's mission. More eloquent, more ambitious, and more politically astute, Gaius broadened reform into a program of social reconstruction. He revived the Land Commission, proposed the founding of colonies to resettle the poor, and introduced subsidized grain, not as charity but as a guarantee of civic stability. He also transferred juries for corruption trials from senators to the equestrian order, curbing senatorial abuse in the provinces. Each of these acts sought to balance power within the Republic, to build a government responsive to more than the aristocracy. But Gaius' energy also frightened his allies. His reforms created a mass political movement unprecedented in Roman history, organized, vocal, and deeply loyal. The Senate struck back, using rhetoric and ritual to reassert control. They sponsored a rival tribune to undermine Gaius' laws and, when tension escalated, invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree granting consuls the right to use force to protect the state. In 121 BCE, Gaius and his supporters were hunted through the streets of Rome. Thousands were killed. Gaius, cornered on the Aventine Hill, ordered a slave to take his life rather than fall to his enemies. The Gracchi brothers' fate revealed a fundamental truth: the Republic could no longer reform itself peacefully. Their attempts to heal inequality exposed the Republic's constitutional fragility, its inability to adapt to empire without breaking its own rules. The Senate clung to authority through repression. The populace learned that power could only be won by defiance. Every future reformer, from Saturninus to Caesar, would follow the pattern set by the Gracchi, appealing to the people, challenging the elite, and facing violence in return. Historians from Appian to Plutarch portray the Gracchi with tragic reverence. Visionaries undone by circumstance, patriots mistaken for revolutionaries. Modern scholarship interprets their era less as moral drama and more as systemic collapse. The Republic's institutions had been designed for a city-state. Now they strained under imperial burdens, wealth inequality, military dependence, and political inertia. The Gracchan crisis was the symptom of an empire governed by laws meant for a village. Archaeological evidence aligns with this narrative. The late 2nd century BCE shows continued urban crowding, the spread of imported luxuries, and a widening rural gap between elite villas and abandoned peasant plots. The redistribution efforts of the Gracchan Land Commission left faint but measurable traces: surveys, boundary stones, and land registries, hints of an effort too brief to alter the trajectory of decline. In death, the Gracchi became symbols of courage to reformers, of danger to conservatives. Statues and cults honored them, while their killers justified their actions as defense of liberty. But beneath the rhetoric, the message was clear: power in Rome was no longer constrained by law. Violence had entered the political process, and it would never fully leave. The Republic had survived wars with Carthage and Macedon, but not its own success. The sons of Rome had tried to save her, and in doing so revealed her fault lines. The sons of Rome sought to save her, and in doing so revealed her fault lines. With reform suppressed and power concentrated, the Republic stood on the edge of civil militarization. By the final decades of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic stood at a crossroads. The triumphs of earlier generations had brought not stability, but strain. The provinces were restive, the Senate corrupt, and the frontiers threatened by enemies unlike any Rome had faced before. The balance between civic duty and personal ambition, once the Republic's foundation, was beginning to fracture. The first tremor came from Africa. In 112 BCE, King Jugurtha of Numidia, a cunning and ruthless monarch, exploited Roman greed to secure his throne. He bribed senators, outmaneuvered legates, and mocked Rome's impotence. "Everything in Rome," he reportedly sneered, "is for sale." The Jugurthine War revealed not only the decay of discipline in the Senate's command system but the Republic's vulnerability to corruption. Into this morass stepped Gaius Marius, a man who personified both the promise and peril of change. Born in Arpinum to an equestrian family, a novice homo, or new man, he was the first in generations to challenge the aristocratic monopoly on power. Marius had risen through the ranks by sheer ability, earning a reputation for endurance and austerity. When the public grew frustrated with senatorial incompetence in Numidia, Marius offered himself as an alternative, a man of action rather than lineage. Elected consul in 107 BCE, he took command of the Jugurthine campaign. His victory was not immediate, but his reforms began to take shape. He recognized a fundamental problem. Rome's armies were built on the backs of property-owning citizens, yet generations of land concentration and economic displacement, the very trends the Gracchi had tried to reverse, had shrunk that base to crisis levels. Rome could no longer recruit enough men under the old system. Marius's solution was radical. He opened the legions to the capitancy, the head count, the poorest citizens who owned no land. For the first time, the landless could serve the state in arms. The Republic, once defended by those with property to protect, would now be defended by those seeking it. To sustain this new army, Marius standardized equipment and training, creating the first professional standing legions in Roman history. Each soldier was issued identical arms and armor, carried his own supplies on a frame, Marius mules as they were mockingly called, and was bound not by civic obligation, but by contract and loyalty to his general, the man who promised him land and reward at war's end. The army became a career. It also became a political weapon. These reforms, though pragmatic, reshaped the Republic at its core. No longer were legions temporary levies raised in crisis and disbanded after victory. They became permanent, cohesive, and mobile instruments of projection and conquest. Strategically, this made Rome unstoppable. Politically, it shifted the balance of power from Senate to soldier, from institution to individual. With his new army, Marius crushed Jugurtha's forces and returned in triumph. But as the African War ended, a greater storm approached. In 113 BCE, migrating tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, began to sweep south through Gaul, defeating Roman armies in a series of devastating battles. The Republic reeled from disaster. Entire legions were annihilated, and panic spread through Italy. In this moment of crisis, the people turned again to Marius. From 104 to 100 BCE, Marius was elected consul 5 consecutive times, a constitutional anomaly that would have horrified the founders of the Republic. But necessity overrode precedent. In those years, Marius became not merely a general, but a savior. He reorganized recruitment, training, and logistics, transforming the legions into a disciplined war machine. His soldiers, drawn from the dispossessed poor, found in him both commander and patron. They fought not for the Senate, but for Marius. His leadership reached its zenith in 102 BCE at Aquisextii, where he annihilated the Teutons, and again in 101 BCE at Vercelli, where he and his subordinate Catulus destroyed the Cimbri. The victories were total. Northern Italy was saved. Rome erupted in celebration. Marius was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. He had preserved the Republic, but in doing so had changed it beyond recognition. Beneath the triumph lay a dangerous precedent. Soldiers now looked to their generals, not the Senate, for reward and identity. When Marius settled his veterans on public land, bypassing senatorial oversight, he formalized a new social contract, the general as benefactor, the army as clientele. Ambitious men across Rome took notice. From this moment onward, the road to power would be paved not through election alone, but through command. Marius's military innovations also began to erode the old civic ideal. The legions no longer represented the citizen farmer defending his homeland. They were professional soldiers, campaigning for plunder and patronage. The Senate, accustomed to controlling armies through law and tradition, found itself overshadowed by men who could command tens of thousands through loyalty alone. The seeds of future civil wars, of Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, were sown in this transformation. Yet to contemporaries, the change was less betrayal than adaptation. The Republic had survived the Cimbrian invasion only because one man had redefined what it meant to serve Rome. Modern historians continue to debate Marius's legacy. Was he a reformer responding pragmatically to demographic collapse, or an opportunist who broke the Republic's military spine for political gain? Archaeological and demographic studies support the former. Italy's free peasantry had indeed declined dramatically by the late 2nd century BCE, leaving few alternatives. The Marian reforms were perhaps inevitable, the military reflection of Rome's social evolution. But the unintended consequences were profound. The legion's professionalization made empire sustainable, yet made republicanism unstable. Each success strengthened the generals who led Rome's armies, not the state that commanded them. Marius himself would live to see his own creation turn against him. As future commanders, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar would wield personal loyalty as the ultimate weapon. In the short term, Marius gave Rome victory. In the long term, he gave it the mechanism of its undoing. Rome's greatest general rearmed her legions, and in doing so, redefined their loyalty. But Marius's military revolution would meet its counterpart in politics, embodied by an aristocrat with equal genius and greater ruthlessness. In 88 BCE, Rome faced a crisis that would redefine the boundaries of power within the Republic. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician of distinguished ancestry, had risen through military competence and political maneuvering to command respect and fear. A veteran of the Jugurthine War and a commander in the Social War, Sulla had proven both his strategic genius and his understanding of Roman politics. Yet the Republic's traditions were about to collide violently with personal ambition. Sulla had been granted command against Mithridates VI of Pontus, whose expansion into Asia Minor threatened Roman provinces and allies. The assignment was a reward for his service and a recognition of his expertise. However, the consul Gaius Marius, seeking to regain prestige and power, circumvented the Senate. Using popular assemblies, Marius succeeded in having the command reassigned to himself, a move unprecedented in Roman practice. The stage was set for confrontation. Law and custom were at odds with the raw power of men who commanded armies. The response from Sulla was shocking. He marched on Rome with his legions, crossing the sacred boundary of the Pomerium. Never before had a Roman general entered the city with troops. The act violated centuries of religious and political taboo, signaling a turning point in the Republic's unwritten rules. Sulla seized the city, declared Marius an enemy, and reinstated the Senate's authority. Yet, by demonstrating that force could supersede law, Sulla had introduced a precedent that would haunt Rome for decades. Once the immediate domestic crisis was contained, Sulla departed for the east to confront Mithridates. There, he demonstrated extraordinary strategic skill, winning decisive victories in Asia Minor and reorganizing the administration of captured territories. Rome's eastern provinces were brought under firm control, consolidating resources and manpower that would support Sulla's later actions in Italy. In 83 BCE, Sulla returned to Italy to confront the Marian faction, now entrenched in Rome. A civil war ensued, bloody, relentless, and thorough. Sulla's forces systematically defeated the opposition, culminating in the capture of the city. He instituted proscriptions, public lists of enemies marked for execution and property confiscation. Senators, equestrians, and equites alike were executed without trial. Their wealth and estates were redistributed to Sulla's supporters. The terror ensured obedience, consolidating power and demonstrating the Republic's vulnerability to military authority. Yet Sulla was not merely a despot. Once his enemies were eliminated, he sought to restore the Republic in form. He strengthened the Senate, increasing its membership and curbing the influence of tribunes, whose power to propose laws and veto measures had enabled populist disruptions. He codified procedures for elections, provincial governance, and legislation measures intended to constrain arbitrary power and reinforce aristocratic control. In his view, the Republic would survive only if its institutions were shielded from popular ambition. In 79 BCE, Sulla voluntarily resigned his dictatorship, retired from public life, and returned to his villa in Puteoli. In doing so, he left Rome with a restored constitution, but one hollowed by precedent. The sword of military authority had entered politics permanently. The Senate, though strengthened on paper, now existed in a world where men commanding armies could redefine law, override custom, and impose their will by force. Sulla's legacy was paradoxical. On one hand, he demonstrated disciplined governance, law codification, and military prowess. On the other, he institutionalized a dangerous truth: loyalty of troops to generals, rather than to the Republic, could determine political outcomes. The Republic's survival henceforth depended not only on institutions but on the character of its commanders, a condition that would pave the way for Pompey, Crassus, and ultimately Julius Caesar. From a modern perspective, Sulla illustrates the tension between constitutionalism and personal power. His actions reveal how republican frameworks, designed for small-scale city-state politics, could be manipulated by ambitious leaders commanding disciplined, professional armies. Archaeological and textual evidence, inscriptions, coinage bearing his image, and the literary accounts of Plutarch and Appian confirm both his military campaigns and the political terror that accompanied them. These sources highlight the dual nature of his influence: administrator and autocrat, restorer and innovator of violence. In conclusion, Sulla's march on Rome and his dictatorship fundamentally altered the Republic. While he left laws and offices intact, he shattered the political ethos that had previously constrained ambition. Rome's governance was no longer solely determined by law or custom. It was now inseparable from military might and the personal authority of generals. His era demonstrated that the Republic could survive conquest abroad, but it could not survive unchecked ambition at home. When Sulla's legions crossed the Pomerium, the Republic itself became a battlefield. Sulla's dictatorship ended, but the Republic he restored could no longer restrain men who commanded armies and ambition alike. Between 91 and 88 BCE, the Roman Republic faced one of its most serious internal crises, the social war, bellum sociali. For decades, the socii, Rome's Italian allies, had provided troops, resources, and loyalty, yet they lacked the full rights of Roman citizenship. Despite their critical role in Rome's wars across Italy and beyond, they remained politically subordinate, denied voting rights and access to magistracies. The resulting tension was both social and military, rooted in decades of inequity and institutional rigidity. The immediate spark came with the assassination of the tribune Marcus Livius Drusus in 91 BCE. Drusus had attempted reforms to extend citizenship to Italian communities, but his murder signaled the Senate's unwillingness to compromise. In response, the allies organized militarily, forming cohesive armies that challenged Rome itself. The rebellion spread rapidly across central and southern Italy, with regions such as Samnium, Apulia, and Picenum declaring independence. The fighting was intense and widespread, involving both conventional battles and guerrilla tactics in the peninsula's mountainous terrain. Despite the formidable resistance, Rome's professional legions, reorganized under Marius and Sulla, proved resilient. Commanders including Pompeius Strabo and Lucius Julius Caesar gradually regained control, employing both military force and diplomacy. The conflict devastated towns, disrupted agriculture, and strained the Republic's treasury. Archaeological evidence, burnt settlements, fortified positions, and disrupted urban layers confirms the war's widespread destructiveness. Rome's response was both pragmatic and transformative. Recognizing that alienation could not be reversed solely by conquest, the Senate extended citizenship to most Italian communities. Laws passed between 90 and 88 BCE granted voting rights and legal integration to former allies, incorporating them into the civic and political structures of the Republic. Municipia and colonies were reorganized, and the Italian peninsula effectively became a unified political space under Roman law. In doing so, Rome transformed the socii from subjects into citizens, resolving a long-standing inequity while securing manpower for future campaigns. The consequences were both positive and destabilizing. Militarily, Rome now commanded a larger citizen army, able to recruit soldiers from previously excluded regions. Economically, the integration of Italian communities facilitated trade, taxation, and standardized legal practices across the peninsula. Politically, however, the enlargement of the citizen body strained existing electoral and representational systems. The increased competition intensified factional rivalries among the elite and encouraged reliance on military power to secure political influence. The social war thus solved one contradiction, inequality among Rome's allies, while exacerbating another, the growing tension between senatorial authority and military populism. Generals commanding professional armies now wielded unprecedented leverage, capable of influencing elections, legislation, and succession. The precedent of armed challenge to the Senate, reinforced by Sulla's actions shortly thereafter, ensured that the Republic's internal stability remained contingent on force as well as law. Historians note the social war as a pivotal moment in the expansion of Roman citizenship. Where Rome once relied on a patchwork of alliances and loyalty oaths, it now relied on formal incorporation, creating a politically unified peninsula. Archaeological and epigraphic sources, including inscriptions recording new citizen roles and municipal grants, demonstrate the administrative scope of this transformation. The war also illustrates the limits of coercion alone. Sustainable integration required legal recognition and institutional adaptation. In conclusion, the social war exemplified the Republic's dual capacity for coercion and accommodation. Through a combination of military resilience and political reform, Rome secured both survival and structural innovation. Yet, the expansion of citizenship also introduced new challenges: elite competition, electoral pressure, and the increasing influence of generals commanding loyal armies. The Italian peninsula had been forged into a single political entity, militarized, legally integrated, and poised for imperial expansion, but the Republic's internal contradictions remained unresolved. Italy had fought against Rome, only to become Rome itself. With Italy united under Roman law, the Republic stood vast, militarized, and unstable, a stage awaiting its next generation of conquerors. Following the resignation and death of Lucius Cornelius Sulla in 78 BCE, the Roman Republic entered a period of apparent calm, a fragile interlude after decades of civil war, dictatorship, and institutional upheaval. Sulla's reforms had strengthened the Senate, increased its membership, and curtailed the powers of the tribunes. While these measures were intended to stabilize governance and prevent popular uprisings, they simultaneously marginalized popular leaders and created a vacuum of political opportunity. Ambitious figures quickly emerged to exploit this space. Among them were three men whose actions would define the late Republic. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose financial power translated into political leverage. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, a young general whose military victories in Sicily, Africa, and Spain had made him immensely popular with both soldiers and the citizenry. And Gaius Julius Caesar, a rising patrician whose populist tendencies and rhetorical skill allowed him to cultivate alliances beyond the traditional senatorial elite. Each represented a different axis of influence: wealth, military prestige, and popular support. Yet all shared a common frustration with the entrenched authority of the Senate, whose aristocratic conservatism increasingly obstructed their ambitions. Early signs of instability surfaced almost immediately. The revolt of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus in 78 BCE, a failed attempt to restore tribune powers, highlighted the fragility of Sulla's system. Soon after, the slave uprising led by Spartacus, 73 to 71 BCE, threatened to destabilize central Italy, requiring extraordinary military mobilization. While the Republic's formal institutions persisted, these crises underscored the dependence on extraordinary generals and the inadequacy of purely legal mechanisms to maintain order. Pompey and Crassus emerged as the state's de facto stabilizers. Their cooperation in suppressing the Spartan revolt, culminating in the decisive defeat of the insurgents in 71 BCE, brought them extraordinary political credit. By 70 BCE, both held the consulship, and together they moved to reverse key elements of Sulla's constitutional reforms, restoring some powers to the tribunes and allowing more flexibility in popular legislation. This effectively signaled the declining authority of the Senate, which found its capacity to enforce law without consent increasingly constrained by personalities commanding armies, wealth, and public loyalty. The political landscape of the late 70s BCE thus reflects a republic still functioning in form but fragmenting in substance. Offices existed, elections were held, and laws were passed. Yet the levers of real power had shifted to men who could command resources and loyalty independent of institutions. The emphasis on personal networks, patronage, and military reputation over constitutional authority marked a decisive change in Roman politics. Senators who previously wielded influence through debate and precedent now found themselves negotiating with or opposing generals who acted according to ambition and expediency. From a structural perspective, this period illustrates the consequences of Sulla's reforms and civil wars. The institutional framework had been preserved, but the cultural norms underpinning it, deference, restraint, and civic loyalty, were eroded. Popular mobilization, military loyalty, and personal wealth had become decisive factors in political outcomes. The Republic, designed for a city-state with a limited citizen body, now struggled to reconcile its expanded territories, professionalized armies, and elite rivalries. Historians such as Plutarch and Appian emphasize that this era set the stage for coalitions that transcended formal constitutional processes, paving the way for alliances such as the First Triumvirate. Archaeological evidence, coinage, and inscriptions from this period indicate the rising prominence of these men in both urban and provincial contexts, demonstrating their influence beyond Rome itself. Public monuments, dedications, and military commemorations reinforced personal prestige over institutional authority, creating a precedent that formal offices alone could not counterbalance. In conclusion, the aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship left the Republic in a paradoxical state. It possessed laws, assemblies, and magistracies. Yet the real engine of power now lay in ambitious men who commanded armies, wealth, and popular loyalty. The revolts of Lepidus and Spartacus illustrated the ongoing vulnerability of the state, while the rise of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar signaled that the next decades would be defined not by consensus but by strategic alliances and personal ambition. Rome was stable in appearance, but the mechanisms that had historically mediated power were no longer sufficient to contain it. In the silence after Sulla, the Republic's strongest men began to listen only to themselves. By the late 60s BCE, foreign campaigns and private ambition would merge into an alliance powerful enough to unmake the Republic. In 67 BCE, the Roman Republic confronted a crisis that was both practical and symbolic. Mediterranean piracy had escalated to the point of threatening Rome's grain supply, disrupting trade, and undermining economic stability. Recognizing the severity, the Senate passed the Lex Gabinia, granting Pompey extraordinary imperium to eliminate the pirates across the entire Mediterranean. This unprecedented concentration of military power in a single commander's hands reflected both the gravity of the problem and the Senate's reliance on exceptional individuals rather than institutional mechanisms. Pompey acted with remarkable speed and efficiency. Within months, he organized a vast fleet, coordinated land and naval operations, and implemented strategic measures to secure the coasts and key harbors. Pirates were cornered and defeated systematically, and Rome's grain shipments resumed without interruption. Pompey's success earned him near-universal acclaim, demonstrating the effectiveness of decisive command and the political leverage it could produce. Coins and inscriptions from this period celebrate the pacification of the Mediterranean, highlighting how military achievement translated directly into public honor and political capital. Shortly afterward, the Lex Manilia, 66 BCE, granted Pompey command in the long-standing war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, extending Rome's involvement deep into the eastern Mediterranean. Mithridates had been a persistent challenge for decades, forming coalitions of client states and exploiting regional instability to resist Roman authority. Over 3 years, Pompey dismantled these alliances, decisively defeating Mithridates' forces, reorganizing former territories, and annexing Syria as a province. He also established client kingdoms in Asia Minor and restructured Judea, balancing direct control with local governance to stabilize the region. Archaeological evidence, including coinage, administrative inscriptions, and urban foundations, confirms the breadth and permanence of Pompey's eastern settlements. Pompey's conquests were as much administrative as martial. By extending Roman law, taxation systems, and political oversight into newly integrated territories, he created a model for imperial governance that combined military occupation with diplomatic incorporation. The settlements preserved a measure of local autonomy, securing loyalty while embedding Roman authority. This approach prefigured the methods Rome would later apply in Egypt, Gaul, and the eastern provinces, demonstrating the Republic's ability to project power far beyond Italy. However, Pompey's successes created domestic tension. On his return to Rome in 62 BCE, the Senate hesitated to ratify his eastern settlements and resisted granting land to his veterans. Senators, wary of the extraordinary powers he wielded abroad, sought to curb his influence, revealing the growing rift between institutional authority and personal prestige. Pompey, once the Senate's enforcer, now found himself politically constrained, despite military triumphs that had expanded the Republic's dominion to its greatest extent yet. This blockage had long-term consequences. The Senate's reluctance drove Pompey toward a pragmatic alliance with Julius Caesar and Marcus Licinius Crassus, forming the First Triumvirate. Each man brought complementary strengths. Caesar offered popular appeal and legislative skill. Crassus, immense wealth, and Pompey, military authority and public acclaim. Together, they could bypass traditional senatorial resistance, achieving reforms, land allocations, and political appointments that had been impossible individually. The alliance exemplified how extraordinary personal influence could bend constitutional structures, highlighting the tension between republican norms and individual power. Pompey's eastern campaigns thus illuminate a critical dynamic of late Republican Rome. Military expansion directly reshaped domestic politics. Triumphs abroad were inseparable from political leverage at home. public acclamation, veteran loyalty, and control of territories became instruments of influence, often outweighing the formal authority of offices or assemblies. This period demonstrates that Rome's institutional framework, designed for city-state governance, was increasingly inadequate for managing empire, leaving room for personal ambition to dictate outcomes. In conclusion, Pompey's Eastern achievements extended Roman hegemony to new heights, stabilizing the Mediterranean and integrating diverse territories into the Republic's orbit. Yet these successes also exposed the fragility of traditional republican mechanisms. The Senate's inability to reward or check Pompey underscored the shift from institutional consensus to personal alliance. His campaigns set the stage for the First Triumvirate, illustrating how military accomplishment, political frustration, and individual ambition converged to bend the Republic toward oligarchic coordination, and ultimately toward crisis. Pompey returned from the East crowned with glory, and met a Senate too small for his shadow. To achieve their ambitions, three men would form a pact, one that bent the Republic to their will. In 60 BCE, the political landscape of the Roman Republic shifted dramatically with the formation of a private alliance orchestrated by Gaius Julius Caesar. Known to later historians as the First Triumvirate, this informal coalition united Caesar, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus in a pact grounded in mutual interest rather than legal recognition. Each member pursued distinct objectives. Pompey sought ratification of his eastern settlements and land allocations for his veterans. Crassus desired financial relief for equestrian tax collectors and increased influence over provincial revenues. Caesar sought consular power and subsequent provincial command, aiming to secure political and military opportunity. The triumvirs effectively circumvented traditional senatorial authority. In Caesar's consulship of 59 BCE, the coalition coordinated popular support, legislative pressure, and strategic alliances to pass measures that advanced their interests. Laws affirming Pompey's settlements and distributing land to his veterans were enacted despite aristocratic resistance. Caesar's legislative skill, combined with the personal prestige and resources of his partners, demonstrated the capacity of informal oligarchic cooperation to override centuries-old republican conventions. Assemblies, tribunician powers, and public agitation became instruments of a political strategy centered on personal authority rather than institutional procedure. Caesar's subsequent appointment as proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, and later governor of Transalpine Gaul, transformed the alliance into a platform for military expansion and personal prestige. Here, the mechanisms of the Republic facilitated extraordinary concentration of power. Provincial command granted autonomy, army loyalty, and wealth, resources Caesar would later leverage in the civil wars. Pompey and Crassus retained influence at home, using their positions to manage Rome's domestic politics and shield Caesar from opposition. Despite its effectiveness, the triumvirate was inherently unstable, relying on personal bonds rather than legal sanction. The alliance was reinforced through marriage. Julia, Caesar's daughter, married Pompey, intertwining familial loyalty with political cooperation. However, unforeseen events destabilized this foundation. The death of Julia in 54 BCE removed a critical personal link between Caesar and Pompey, while Crassus's catastrophic defeat and death at Carrhae 53 BCE eliminated the third pillar of the coalition. Without these bonds, the careful balance of ambition gave way to rivalry and mutual suspicion. By the late 50s BCE, the triumviral framework had disintegrated into competition. Pompey, now aligned with conservative senators, increasingly opposed Caesar's legislative and military agendas. Caesar, commanding legions loyal to him personally, represented a threat that could no longer be contained by traditional republican mechanisms. The Senate's authority, already eroded by years of personal alliances, proved powerless to mediate between men who wielded armies, wealth, and popular support as instruments of political leverage. The First Triumvirate exemplifies a broader transformation in late Republican politics. Informal coalitions could supersede constitutional norms, while personal loyalty, military power, and financial resources became decisive determinants of governance. What began as cooperative expediency quickly evolved into a contest for dominance. demonstrating that the Republic's institutional framework was insufficient to manage the ambitions of extraordinary individuals. In essence, the triumvirate redefined political power in Rome, replacing collective governance with oligarchic negotiation and setting the stage for civil conflict. In conclusion, the formation and eventual dissolution of the First Triumvirate highlights both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the late Roman Republic. By uniting three of the most influential men of the era, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus demonstrated the capacity of personal alliances to achieve extraordinary political objectives. Yet the coalition's dependence on relationships rather than law rendered it fragile. Its collapse directly precipitated a crisis in authority, leading inexorably towards civil war and the march of Caesar's army on Rome, an event that would permanently alter the trajectory of the Republic. 3 men ruled Rome, but only one could rule alone. When the balance broke, the Republic faced the unthinkable, another Roman army marching on Rome. By 50 BCE, the delicate equilibrium between Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus had deteriorated into outright hostility. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, 58 to 50 BCE, had produced unparalleled military success, territorial expansion, and vast wealth. He commanded legions whose loyalty lay firmly with him, forged through years of shared hardship, discipline, and reward. Meanwhile, political dynamics in Rome, dominated by the Senate and influenced by Pompey, increasingly sought to constrain him. Orders were issued demanding that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, effectively stripping him of military power and leaving him vulnerable to prosecution for prior political actions. Caesar refused. In January 49 BCE, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, a narrow boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Ancient sources, including Suetonius and Plutarch, record his declaration, Alia iacta est. The die is cast. This act was both literal and symbolic. Militarily, it constituted rebellion against the Senate. Politically, it represented the end of collective governance. By placing his army in Italy, Caesar ensured that force, rather than law or precedent, dictated political authority. The Senate, under Pompey's influence, fled Rome and regrouped in southern Italy and Greece, believing that superior numbers and wealth could secure victory. Caesar, in contrast, moved with speed and decisiveness. He avoided protracted urban combat, relied on rapid maneuvering, and offered clemency to defeated political opponents, fostering loyalty among those who might otherwise resist. By the end of 49 BCE, he controlled both Rome and strategic regions in Spain, stabilizing finances, reorganizing administrative functions, and preparing for confrontation with Pompey's assembled forces. This crossing of the Rubicon was a turning point. The Republic's constitutional framework had been rendered obsolete. Authority no longer resided in assemblies, magistrates, or the Senate. It was embodied in the command of armies and the strategic decisions of one man. Historians interpret this moment as the death of the Republican order, a structural rupture that would make civil war inevitable. Caesar's choice demonstrated both personal initiative and systemic vulnerability. The Republic could not constrain men who controlled professional, loyal, and autonomous armies. The psychological and political ramifications were immediate. Cities and provinces were forced to declare allegiance. Factions within Rome fractured, and the moral authority of the Senate was eroded. Caesar's strategy emphasized speed, clemency, and the projection of inevitability, undermining potential resistance before it could consolidate. His actions illustrated a principle that would recur in Roman history. Control of the military equaled control of the state. In crossing the Rubicon, Caesar set in motion a civil conflict that was both institutional and existential. Military operations, political maneuvering, and social compliance became intertwined. The Republic, which had survived centuries of conquest and internal reform, now faced collapse not from foreign enemies but from the concentration of power in a single individual. This event underscores a broader historical pattern. When institutional mechanisms fail to regulate extraordinary actors, the very structure of governance is threatened. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome crossed a boundary that could never be recrossed. The Senate's armies waited across the sea, and the fate of the Republic waited with them. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar pursued Pompey and the senatorial faction to Greece, where they had assembled substantial forces, drawing on loyal legions, allied contingents, and financial reserves. Despite being numerically inferior, Caesar's army consisted of veterans hardened by a decade of campaigns in Gaul. These troops demonstrated remarkable discipline, cohesion, and tactical flexibility, qualities that would prove decisive in the coming confrontation. The two forces met on August 9, 48 BCE, at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Caesar's formations were deliberately structured to counter Pompey's numerical advantage. The battle revealed the superiority of experienced, highly motivated forces over traditional reliance on aristocratic prestige and sheer numbers. At key moments, Caesar's reserves were deployed to plug gaps and exploit weaknesses, while Pompey's reliance on overconfidence and fragmented command proved fatal. Ancient sources, including Plutarch and Appian, note that the encounter was decisive both strategically and symbolically. The Republic's defenders were vanquished by a man whose legitimacy derived from personal command rather than office. Following the battle, Pompey fled south toward Egypt, seeking refuge under Ptolemy XIII. However, the young pharaoh, advised by his court, had Pompey assassinated on arrival, hoping to curry favor with Caesar. When Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly thereafter, he is said to have wept at the sight of Pompey's severed head, a gesture recorded by multiple classical historians as a mixture of personal grief, political statement, and calculated clemency. The victory at Pharsalus effectively ended the civil war on the battlefield. Caesar had defeated Rome's most prominent general and neutralized the senatorial coalition. Yet the moral and institutional implications were profound. The Republic's capacity to mediate disputes through law, magistracy, or tradition had been shattered. Authority now resided in the personal command of armies and the strategic decisions of an individual, undermining centuries of precedent. Caesar's actions following Pharsalus emphasized restraint and political strategy. He pursued remaining opposition judiciously, seeking to stabilize the state while consolidating personal power. Provinces were reorganized, key cities pacified, and rival factions gradually incorporated or neutralized. The lesson of Pharsalus was clear. Control of military force equated to control of political destiny, and the era of collective governance had given way to one dominated by individual initiative. In conclusion, the campaign of 49 to 48 BCE illustrates the transformation of the Roman Republic into a personalized political system. The crossing of the Rubicon and the subsequent victory at Pharsalus highlight the vulnerabilities inherent in a system that relied on citizen soldiers, assemblies, and magistrates when confronted with professional armies under charismatic commanders. These events set the stage for Caesar's dictatorship, defining the final decades of republican governance and foreshadowing the transition from republic to principate. On the plains of Pharsalus, the republic's defenders fell, and with them, the illusion of shared power. Pompey was gone, but Caesar's victory left one question unanswered. What would he build upon the ruins of the republic? Following his decisive victories and consolidation of power, Julius Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE as the undisputed master of the republic. By 44 BCE, he had been appointed dictator perpetuo, perpetual dictator, formalizing what was effectively a lifetime concentration of authority. His tenure marked a radical transformation of republican governance, blending personal command with institutional reform. Caesar's reforms were comprehensive. He centralized administrative functions, standardizing provincial governance to curb corruption and ensure more efficient tax collection. The distribution of land to veterans and regulation of debt sought to address both social instability and economic dislocation caused by decades of civil war. He expanded citizenship to communities throughout Italy and beyond, integrating diverse populations into Roman political and legal frameworks. Symbolically, Caesar restructured the calendar, instituting the Julian calendar, aligning Rome's civil year with the solar cycle and asserting authority over temporal as well as political order. Public works, grain distribution, and urban beautification further consolidated popular support, demonstrating the practical and ideological dimensions of his power. Yet Caesar's reforms provoked profound unease among the Senate and traditionalists. Many saw in his accumulation of honors, his portraits and statues in public spaces, and his association with divine imagery the shadow of monarchy, a system Rome had long rejected. Former allies, including senators who had once supported him, now questioned whether the republic itself could survive one man's dominance. The line between necessary reform and autocracy had blurred. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar attended a Senate meeting in the Theatre of Pompey. There, a conspiracy led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, supported by a faction of senators fearful of permanent tyranny, executed their plan. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Contemporary accounts, including those of Suetonius and Plutarch, depict a mixture of surprise, betrayal, and shock among both participants and observers. The conspirators claimed their act would restore liberty, yet the outcome was the opposite. Caesar's death plunged Rome into immediate instability. The populace mourned him as a martyr, and his veteran legions, loyal to their commander, demanded vengeance. Political violence escalated, and the vacuum of power rapidly attracted ambitious generals and politicians, including Mark Antony and Octavian, leading to a new era of civil war. The assassination illustrates a critical paradox of late Republican politics. Attempts to preserve institutional principles through violent intervention may accelerate systemic collapse. In eliminating Caesar, the conspirators destroyed not just the individual but the fragile equilibrium that had allowed Rome to function after decades of internal strain. The Republic, as a governing system rooted in collegiality, annual office, and senatorial oversight, no longer existed in practice. Authority now resided in armed men and charismatic leadership. Caesar's dictatorship, though controversial, had sought structural and social stabilization. Yet the concentration of power, whether justified or pragmatic, exposed the Republic's institutional fragility. The Ides of March marks both the literal death of one man and the symbolic end of Republican governance. Rome had entered the final phase of transformation, in which succession, loyalty, and force, rather than legal precedent or civic consensus, would determine authority. They struck to save the Republic, and struck down its last illusion. In the wake of Caesar's death, a new struggle began, not for liberty, but for succession. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE did not restore the Republic. Instead, it created a power vacuum that revealed the fragility of Roman political structures. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, misjudged both the loyalty of the populace and the depth of support for Caesar. Rather than celebrating liberty, the urban plebs, Caesar's veterans, and provincial elites rallied around the memory of the dictator. The ideal of a restored republic proved insufficient to counter the momentum of personal loyalty and militarized authority. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant and consul at the time, quickly seized the initiative. He orchestrated a public funeral in the Forum, delivering a speech that both mourned Caesar and incited the people against the assassins. Contemporary accounts, including those of Appian and Plutarch, describe Antony displaying Caesar's wounds and cloak, appealing to emotion and civic memory to delegitimize the conspirators. The mob's reaction was immediate. Public unrest erupted, homes were looted, and Brutus and Cassius were forced to flee Rome. Antony had turned grief into political leverage, consolidating his position as the natural heir to Caesar's authority. Meanwhile, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son and heir, returned from Illyricum at the age of 18. Though young and untested, Octavian leveraged both legitimacy and strategy. By cultivating loyalty among Caesar's veterans and appealing to urban plebeians, he positioned himself as a rival claimant to the power Antony now wielded. The Senate, caught between fear and indecision, failed to assert effective control. Rome became a city divided with competing centers of influence, Antony commanding the military and Octavian commanding the narrative of Caesar's legacy. By 43 BCE, the chaos culminated in the formation of the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned institution under the Lex Titia, granting Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus near absolute power for the restoration of the state. Unlike Caesar's informal accumulation of authority, the triumvirate possessed legal validation, yet its enforcement relied on military supremacy and political ruthlessness. The proscriptions, a brutal campaign of political elimination, returned with unprecedented scale. Hundreds of senators, equestrians, and equites were killed, including Cicero, whose eloquence had opposed Antony. Liberty, once the declared goal of Brutus and Cassius, had been violently redefined into obedience under armed authority. The early months of the triumvirate demonstrated both coordination and tension. Lepidus, although technically equal, remained politically marginal. Antony exercised control over the East and Italy. Octavian maintained influence in the West and over Caesar's loyalists. Their cooperation was pragmatic, founded on mutual benefit rather than shared ideology. Yet the foundations of their power rested on fear, loyalty, and violence rather than consensus or precedent. The Roman state at this juncture was simultaneously enormous and unstable. The city of Rome was restless, veterans demanded reward, and provinces awaited administration and protection. The triumvirs faced external challenges. Brutus and Cassius had gathered forces in Macedonia, and internal suspicion, as each man understood that the alliance was temporary. Historical sources emphasized the fragility of coalitions grounded in personal ambition rather than institutional legitimacy. This phase underscores a central paradox of late Republican politics. Acts of vengeance intended to restore liberty instead accelerated the concentration of power into the hands of a few. The men who had killed a dictator found themselves facing his heirs, armed, organized, and adored. Rome's constitutional framework, already weakened by decades of civil war and institutional erosion, could not withstand the pressure of competing strongmen commanding professional armies. The men who killed a dictator found themselves facing his heirs, armed, organized, and adored. The Republic's avengers now shared power, and soon they would destroy each other for it. In the autumn of 42 BCE, the armies of the Second Triumvirate confronted the forces of the so-called liberators Brutus and Cassius in Macedonia. These engagements, known collectively as the Battles of Philippi, were the culmination of years of civil strife, a clash between Republican idealism and the raw power of militarized authority. Brutus and Cassius had assembled forces loyal to the Senate, drawing on veterans of the eastern provinces and local levies, while Antony and Octavian combined Caesar's veterans with newly levied troops. The stakes were existential. Victory for the triumvirs would solidify the legacy of Caesar and extinguish the last organized resistance to their dominance. The first encounter at Philippi saw Cassius' forces engaged in a complex series of maneuvers against Octavian's army. Miscommunication and battlefield setbacks contributed to Cassius' misjudgment of the unfolding situation. Believing defeat imminent, Cassius committed suicide on October 3, 42 BCE. Meanwhile, Brutus, commanding the northern wing, achieved tactical successes, temporarily holding his positions and demonstrating the enduring skill of Republican commanders. However, Antony's adaptability and Octavian's disciplined pressure gradually turned the tide. Over the course of the second engagement, Brutus' army was encircled and overwhelmed. Recognizing the futility of further resistance, Brutus took his own life, reportedly uttering the stoic acknowledgement that he had failed to preserve the Republic. The strategic consequences were immediate and decisive. The Mediterranean world was divided among the triumvirs. Antony controlled the eastern provinces, including Greece and Asia Minor. Octavian secured the west, encompassing Italy, Gaul, and Hispania, and Lepidus governed Africa, though his role would diminish in the years to come. This practical division of authority, while stabilizing short-term governance, created structural tensions. Antony's eastern sphere brought him into contact with the wealth and political culture of Hellenistic monarchies, while Octavian's control of Italy allowed him to cultivate the image of defender of traditional Roman virtue. The ideological dimension of this post-Philippi settlement became evident quickly. Antony embraced elements of Hellenistic royal culture, culminating in his alliance and eventual romantic partnership with Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Octavian, conversely, emphasized Roman traditionalism, portraying himself as a restorer of mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, and a protector of Rome against foreign influence and domestic disorder. Propaganda, coinage, and public games were harnessed to consolidate support, particularly among veterans whose loyalty could determine the outcome of the next phase of political competition. Philippi also symbolized the death of the republican cause. The suicides of Brutus and Cassius extinguished organized senatorial military resistance, leaving the triumvirs unchallenged by principled opposition. Though many senators and local magistrates remained, their influence had become subordinate to the will of armed strongmen. The moral authority once associated with republican ideals had been eclipsed by the practical reality of power and survival. In the eyes of contemporaries and later historians, the twin battles marked not only the military triumph of Antony and Octavian, but also the definitive collapse of a system that had governed Rome for nearly 5 centuries. Furthermore, the aftermath of Philippi set in motion the conditions for the next and final phase of civil war. The triumvirate's internal cohesion was inherently unstable. Lepidus, sidelined by political maneuvering, would soon be marginalized. Antony's focus on the east and Octavian's consolidation in the west created separate power bases, fostering rivalry. As historian Appian notes, the Republic's final war was not fought over ideology but over control, wealth, and legitimacy. Octavian's mastery of political messaging, combined with his ability to maintain the loyalty of Rome's core armies, would eventually tip the balance in his favor. The psychological and cultural resonance of Philippi was profound. In contemporary Roman memory, liberty had not been destroyed with fanfare or public confrontation, but through the quiet tragedy of the defeated. 2 swords turned inward, a nation's ideals extinguished by the very men who had once claimed to defend them. This moment crystallized a critical lesson of late Republican history. Organizational capacity, unity of command, and popular loyalty consistently outweighed abstract principles when these forces came into conflict. At Philippi, liberty died not with a roar, but with the silence of 2 swords turned inward. With their enemies gone, the triumvirs turned upon each other, and the Republic's last war began. By the early 30s BCE, the Second Triumvirate had long fractured. The political and personal alliance that had united Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus after Philippi could no longer withstand ambition, distrust, and competing power bases. Lepidus had been effectively removed from influence, leaving the rivalry between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east as the decisive contest for supremacy. Antony's alliance and romantic entanglement with Cleopatra VII of Egypt provided Octavian with a potent propaganda tool. He depicted Antony as a traitor to Roman traditions, seduced by foreign wealth and luxury, threatening Rome's moral and political foundations. Octavian carefully constructed his campaign as a defensive struggle, portraying the coming war not as civil discord but as a national defense against foreign influence. He cultivated loyalty among Italian populations, veterans, and senators, emphasizing Antony's perceived betrayal of Roman values. Cleopatra's image as an Eastern queen, while politically astute for Egypt, became a liability in Roman discourse, framing the conflict in terms of East versus Rome and traditional virtue versus decadence. The decisive confrontation occurred at Actium, a naval engagement off the western coast of Greece, on September 2, 31 BCE. Antony's fleet, though numerically superior, suffered from internal coordination issues and diminished morale. Octavian's admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, leveraged superior seamanship, logistical planning, and tactical innovation to outmaneuver Antony's forces. During the battle, Antony and Cleopatra executed a tactical withdrawal, abandoning much of their fleet and leaving their land forces exposed. Their retreat to Egypt marked the effective end of organized opposition to Octavian's dominance. Within the following year, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, removing the last rival claimants to imperial authority. Octavian's victory at Actium established him as the uncontested master of the Roman world. In 27 BCE, he orchestrated a carefully staged political settlement. He formally restored powers to the Senate and the people of Rome. In return, The Senate granted him the honorific title Augustus, along with extraordinary authority over provinces and armies. This settlement represented both a continuation and transformation. Republican forms, magistracies, assemblies, and senatorial deliberation were preserved in appearance, yet real power was centralized in the princeps, or first citizen. The republic had not been formally abolished. It had evolved into an autocracy disguised as constitutional continuity. The Principate marked a subtle but profound reorganization of political power. Augustus retained the outward trappings of republican institutions, using tradition and ceremony to legitimize authority. He controlled the imperial provinces, where the legions were stationed, while leaving senatorial provinces nominally under senatorial administration. Public assemblies continued to meet, magistrates were elected, and the Senate debated legislation, all under the guiding influence of Augustus, whose auctoritas and imperium gave him the decisive voice. This transformation reflected centuries of adaptation under pressure. Civil wars, institutional strain, military reforms, and personal ambition had collectively demonstrated the limits of republican governance. Augustus' genius lay in balancing continuity with authority. The forms of the republic were retained to legitimize rule, while practical command rested in a single individual. In doing so, he ensured both political stability and public acceptance, inaugurating an era that historians term the Pax Augusta. The consequences were far-reaching. Rome entered a period of relative internal peace, expansion of infrastructure, and administrative reform. Yet this stability came at the cost of traditional liberty. Citizens no longer wielded decisive power over military appointments or foreign policy. Ultimate authority resided in the princeps, backed by personal loyalty and control of the legions. The Republic's centuries-old experiment with shared governance had ended, replaced by a system capable of enduring for centuries while maintaining the illusion of popular and senatorial participation. Actium thus symbolizes both conclusion and beginning. It ended the final armed resistance to centralized authority and inaugurated the era of the Principate. Rome's transformation was neither abrupt nor chaotic. It was the product of gradual erosion, repeated crises, and cumulative precedent. By concentrating power in a single figure while maintaining institutional forms, Augustus created a model of governance that reconciled Roman tradition with practical necessity. On the shores of Actium, the last battle of the Republic gave birth to the first emperor. Peace had returned, but at a price. Freedom had become stability, and the Republic had become empire. Although the Roman Republic formally ended with Augustus' consolidation of power in 27 BCE, its institutional legacy persisted in subtle and profound ways. The emperor deliberately preserved the Senate, the magistracies, and the legal frameworks that had defined republican governance, creating the illusion of continuity while concentrating real authority in the imperial office. Senators continued to hold titles and occupy offices, participating in debates and ceremonial duties. The cursus honorum, the traditional sequence of magistracies, remained intact, allowing both senatorial and equestrian elites to maintain prestige and social standing. Yet ultimate decision-making, especially over military command and provincial governance, lay with the princeps. Provincial administration was another area where republican practices endured. Augustus and his successors adapted the republic system of censuses, taxation, and municipal self-governance to imperial needs. Provinces were categorized into senatorial and imperial jurisdictions, the latter directly controlled by the emperor. Local elites retained a degree of autonomy, serving as magistrates or municipal councils, while contributing to the collection of taxes and maintenance of public order. In this way, imperial bureaucracy relied on republican precedent to manage a sprawling and diverse empire efficiently. The legal and ceremonial language of the republic also persisted. Emperors invoked libertas, auctoritas, civitas, and other republican virtues to legitimize their authority. Coins, inscriptions, and public works celebrated traditional titles and offices even as the emperor exercised supreme power. This careful mimicry reassured citizens and elites, framing imperial rule not as tyranny but as the natural evolution of Roman political life. In effect, the Republic survived as a grammar of legitimacy. Its offices, rituals, and legal norms continued to structure political and civic life under imperial oversight. Citizens engaged with familiar frameworks, assemblies, magistracies, and courts, while recognizing that ultimate authority rested in a single individual. This continuity fostered stability, eased the transition from shared governance to autocracy, and provided a model of legitimacy that would influence successive regimes for centuries. Though the Republic fell, its offices continued to speak, their titles now whispered under an emperor's rule. As imperial Rome thrived, the memory of the Republic became a moral compass, a lost ideal to which all successors compared themselves. Though the Roman Republic ceased to exist as a governing body in 27 BCE, its moral and political ideals endured far beyond the Mediterranean. Writers, historians, and philosophers preserved an image of Rome defined by civic duty, disciplined citizenship, and balanced governance. Cicero, in particular, emphasized the virtues of justice, moderation, and the responsibilities of magistrates, framing the Republic as a system where power was constrained by law and custom. Livy's monumental histories presented Rome as a model of civic virtue, contrasting the excesses of individuals with the necessity of collective responsibility. Stoic philosophers further reinforced this moral framework, interpreting Rome's institutions as instruments for the cultivation of virtue and ethical public conduct. These texts ensured that the Republic remained a standard for evaluating governance long after the legions had been disbanded and the Senate's authority eclipsed. During the Renaissance, the rediscovery and translation of Roman political texts reinvigorated interest in Republican thought. Humanist scholars such as Machiavelli examined Roman consuls, tribunes, and the Senate not as historical curiosities but as models for mixed government. They admired the Republic's capacity to combine aristocratic oversight, popular participation, and executive authority, an early experiment in balancing competing sources of power. These studies influenced the development of modern political philosophy, particularly debates surrounding checks and balances, civic virtue, and institutional design. In the early modern period, the Republic's legacy shaped practical governance across Europe. The Dutch Republic and the Venetian oligarchy adopted Roman-inspired principles of collective deliberation and constrained authority. The English Commonwealth, during the mid-17th century, referenced Roman republicanism as a justification for limiting monarchical power. In the 18th century, the founding fathers of the United States explicitly cited Roman precedents in drafting their constitution. The Senate, the principle of separation of powers, and the conceptual framework for citizen participation drew directly from Roman models, adapted to a new political and cultural context. Thus, the Roman Republic transcended its historical lifespan. It became a metaphor for virtue, civic order, and the rule of law, studied wherever liberty was debated. Its influence was not limited to formal structures. The language of Roman governance, the ideal of the citizen soldier, and the tension between authority and accountability continued to inform debates about morality and politics for millennia. The Republic's institutions and practices persisted not only as a guide to political organization, but as a cultural touchstone for evaluating human behavior and civic responsibility. Rome's Republic did not vanish. It transformed into an idea, studied wherever liberty was debated. Yet ideas, like institutions, evolve, and the Republic's legacy would find new forms in law, language, and identity. The Roman Republic's most tangible inheritance may have been its law and civic culture, which outlived the institutions that created them and became the foundation for Western political thought. Roman jurisprudence, shaped over centuries, combined codified statutes, customary law, and practical edicts. The 12 Tables, c. 451 to 450 BCE, provided the first publicly accessible legal code, ensuring that citizens could understand obligations, rights, and punishments. Over time, praetors issued edicts adapting law to new circumstances, and the Senate and magistrates contributed decrees that structured civic and commercial life. Principles such as property rights, contractual obligation, inheritance, and due process, cornerstones of modern legal systems, can trace their ancestry to these republican practices. This body of law was not static. It evolved with the Republic's expansion, absorbing Italic, Hellenistic, and eventually provincial influences, demonstrating both adaptability and durability. Language amplified the Republic's legacy. Latin, initially a regional Italic tongue, became the language of governance, administration, and scholarship. It persisted through the empire, permeated the medieval church, and provided the vocabulary for law, science, and philosophy across Europe for over a millennium. Latin's structure and lexicon carried the conceptual framework of Roman governance and civic organization, encoding republican ideals into the very words used to manage human affairs. The republican calendar, census procedures, and civic rituals survived as markers of civic rhythm, reappearing in medieval administrative cycles and European civic festivals. Roman architecture also reflected civic and legal values. The Forum, the spatial heart of public life, served as a meeting place for magistrates, assemblies, and courts. Its design informed medieval town squares, Renaissance civic centers, and modern parliamentary buildings, embedding the Republic's ideal of public deliberation into urban space. Symbols such as the fasces, rods bound with an axe, represented the authority and unity of office, while the emblem SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, signified the intertwined sovereignty of Senate and people. Both continued as visual shorthand for lawful power, civic duty, and authority long after the Republic ceased to exist politically. Even under the Empire, the Republic's intellectual DNA persisted. Administrative practices, legal principles, and civic rituals guided imperial governance, serving as a stabilizing framework and moral reference. Christian institutions adapted Roman organizational models, including legal codification and hierarchical administration, further embedding republican precedents in cultural memory. Later European states consciously invoked Roman models when drafting constitutions, structuring senates, and codifying law. The Republic's enduring influence was not merely symbolic. It was structural, shaping how governments functioned, how societies understood justice, and how citizens perceived their obligations to the state. Ultimately, the Republic survives in the architecture of law, the cadence of civic life, and the symbolic lexicon of governance. Its influence is invisible yet omnipresent, forming the scaffolding of modern political, legal, and administrative systems. From codified statutes to parliamentary squares, from Latin terminology to civic ritual, the Roman Republic continues to mold human organization, demonstrating that history governs not only through memory but through enduring structure. Long after the Senate's last session faded, the Republic lived on in law, language, and the design of every government that followed. From forum to parliament, from lex to constitution, the Republic endures as both foundation and mirror of modern civilization. If the story of Rome's Republic, its triumphs, trials, and enduring legacy, has captured your imagination, subscribe and follow Nightfall History for more journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations. Explore the past and see how it continues to shape the world around us.